Welcome back, my dear traveler. Tonight we journey deep into the story of one of the most fascinating, most terrible, and most tragically complex figures in all of Tolkien's legendarium. Tonight we follow the long and winding road of a spirit who began in light and ended in shadow, a being who was forged in the earliest music of creation and slowly, over countless ages of the world, became something so dark, so consuming, so utterly consumed by his own hunger for order and dominion, that his very name became a whisper of dread across every corner of Middle-earth. Tonight, dear traveler, we trace the complete history of Sauron, from his earliest days as Mairon the Admirable, a bright and gifted spirit in the service of creation, all the way through his many incarnations, his deceptions, his wars, his rings of power, and his final unmaking at the edge of a mountain of fire. So before we go any further, I want you to settle in, find your coziest spot, pull the blanket a little closer, let your pillow cradle the weight of your head, and allow your body to sink gently into the warmth around you. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose, hold it just for a moment, and then let it go softly through your lips. Feel the tension in your shoulders ease. Feel the quiet of the night gather around you like a gentle tide. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be, no urgency at all. Just this voice, just this story, just the soft and endless dark beyond your closed eyes. And as you breathe, I want you to imagine something. Imagine that you are standing at the edge of a vast and timeless place, somewhere before the world had form, before mountains rose from stone, before rivers carved their silver paths through green valleys, before stars were kindled in the vault of the sky. Imagine the hush of that primordial stillness, where thought and music and light are all the same thing, where every possibility that the world might ever hold exists as a single radiant note in a song that has not yet been sung. You are at the very beginning of things, dear traveler, and in this boundless and luminous place, somewhere in the choir of the first great music, a single voice rises, careful, precise, beautiful, devoted to the perfection of craft and the elegance of order. That voice belongs to the spirit who will one day be known as Sauron, but not yet, not for a very long time yet. For now he is simply Mairon, and he shines. Before we continue on into this long and remarkable tale, I want you, my weary listener, to take just a moment and leave a comment below telling me where you are in the world tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love to imagine all of you gathered from so many different corners of this earth, some of you in the deep of night, some just settling in for an afternoon rest, some halfway around the world from each other, and yet all sharing this same quiet space, this same unhurried story. So do let me know, and then let this story carry you. Let us begin then at the very beginning, which, in Tolkien's mythology, is a beginning of breathtaking scope and beauty. In the philosophy that underlies all of Tolkien's world, the universe was created by a being of supreme and incomprehensible power known as Eru Ilúvatar, the One, the All-Father, the source of all that is and all that will ever be. Before anything existed that we might recognize as a world, before matter, before light, before time itself, in any form we would understand, Eru brought forth from his own thought a great multitude of spirits. These were the Ainur, the Holy Ones, beings of immense beauty and power, each one a reflection of some facet of Eru's own mind and imagination. They were, in a sense, the first thoughts of God given independent life, and they moved through that earliest void like flames, brilliant and free. And Eru spoke to the Ainur, and he said, "I have set a flame in your hearts. Sing to me." And so they did. Each of the Ainur began to weave a theme of music, the greatest music ever made or ever to be made, a symphony of such vast and intricate splendor that even to try to imagine it is to feel something stir in the chest, some deep and wordless recognition of beauty, larger than any individual mind can fully hold. This was the music of the Ainur, the Ainulindala, and it was not merely sound, it was creation itself, each note a thread of the world to come. Each harmony, a valley or a mountain range, or a turning of the seasons. Now, In this earliest of all times, among the Aina who sang and moved and thought and loved, there were those of especially great power and those of lesser, more delicate gifts. Some were vast in might, their themes bold and sweeping. These would become the Valar, the great ones, whose power over the world would eventually be enormous. And among them were many others of somewhat lesser initial rank, the Maiar, spirits who served the Valar, who echoed and deepened the themes of their greater kin, who found their joy in working alongside others rather than alone. The Maiar were not lesser in quality or in beauty, only somewhat more focused, somewhat more particular in the domains of their gifts. And somewhere in that great choir, among the Maiar, there sang a spirit of extraordinary talent. His name in those early days was Mairon, and it is said that Mairon was particularly beloved of Aule, one of the greatest of the Valar, the smith of the world, the craftsman, the shaper of stone and metal, and the bones of the earth itself. Mairon loved order, he loved precision, he loved the exquisite satisfaction of a thing made well, of a plan executed without flaw, of every element arranged in its proper and most elegant place. In this he was deeply kindred in spirit to Aule, whose own nature delighted in the making and shaping of physical things, and so Mairon entered the service of Aule, and he was devoted and skilled and genuinely admirable in his gifts, which is, after all, what the name Mairon means. Admirable, excellent, the one who is to be admired. Breathe slowly, dear traveler. Let the music of that first age of the world drift around you. There is nothing sharp here yet, nothing cold, just the warm glow of a spirit in the fullness of its gifts, working and singing and shining. But we must speak of Melkor, because it is impossible to understand Sauron without first understanding Melkor, and what Melkor represented, and why his shadow fell so long and so darkly across everything that came after. Melkor was the greatest of all the Ainur, the most powerful, the most gifted, the one who had received from Eru the widest range of powers and the deepest flame of thought. In the beginning, this greatness was not yet a darkness. It was merely the largest light in the room, the most resonant voice in the choir. But Melkor had a quality that would prove ruinous. He desired to make things of his own devising, things that came from himself alone and acknowledged no other source. He sought the imperishable flame, the creative fire of Eru himself in the void, and he didn't find it because it is with Eru and in Eru and nowhere else. And that frustration, that desperate reaching for a power he could not have, began to twist him. His thoughts turned inward. His themes in the great music grew discordant, dissonant, and finally became a second counter-melody of such proud and willful power that it threatened to drown out the original. But Eru only smiled and expanded the original theme to encompass even the discord, so that Melkor's rebellion became, despite itself, part of the design. This did not please Melkor, and by the time the world, Arda, was made real, fashioned from the vision that the music had described, Melkor had already begun to corrupt what he could reach. He would go into whatever the other Valar built and unseat it, disturb it, introduce cold where there was warmth, drought where there was rain, darkness where there was light, not because he necessarily wanted those things, but because he could not bear for anything to be beautiful and whole and not his own. The Valar would raise mountains, Melkor would shatter them, they would kindle light, he would extinguish it, and in this endless war between making and unmaking, between creation and corruption, the world was shaped, often more jagged and strange and painful than the Valar had intended, but shaped nonetheless. Now, where was Mairon in all of this? This is the question, dear traveler, that lies at the very heart of our story. For a long time, and we are speaking of ages that would dwarf anything we might call history, Mairon served Orla faithfully and well. He learned the deep arts of the smith. He studied how metals were smelted and refined, how patterns could be woven into the structure of physical things, how power could be encoded into objects through the precise application of knowledge and craft and will. He was brilliant. He was diligent. He was, by all accounts, one of the most gifted of the Maiar, and he was admired. And yet somewhere in that bright and careful mind there was a seed of something that would eventually, slowly, unfold into catastrophe. Because Mairon loved order above all things, and Melkor, for all his chaos, offered something that order could never quite supply on its own. Melkor offered power enough to impose order absolutely, to force the world into the shape that one's perfect mind dictated, not to persuade, not to coax, not to work patiently alongside others toward a shared vision, but to command, to make the world obey. And so, in some period of the earliest ages of the world, in those vast and barely charted years before even the first elves awoke, Mairon made a choice. He went to Melkor. He entered the service of the greatest of the Valar gone wrong, the first Dark Lord, the one whose name would eventually be worn away in fear until he was called only Morgoth, the black foe of the world. Mairon became Morgoth's most trusted lieutenant, his greatest servant, his most capable instrument of corruption. And here is something important, dear traveler, something that Tolkien was always very careful to preserve in the lore. Mairon did not go to Morgoth out of malice, not initially. He did not love darkness for darkness's sake. He was not drawn to cruelty as a thing desirable in itself. He went to Morgoth because he believed genuinely, and with the full weight of his extraordinary intelligence behind that belief, that Morgoth was the most efficient path to the ordered, perfected world that Mairon desired. In Tolkien's own letters, he was explicit about this. Sauron's original motive was not evil in the way that Morgoth's was. Morgoth wanted domination for its own sake, loved the destruction and the pain. Sauron wanted to make things work correctly. He just decided that the best tool for the job was absolute power, and absolute power required a master willing to use it absolutely. Let this distinction settle gently in your mind, dear traveler, as you rest. It matters enormously, because it means that Sauron, at least at the beginning of his long fall, was not simply a villain in the straightforward sense. He was something more unsettling, a perfectionist who chose the wrong means, and was then changed step by step by the means he had chosen until the ends and the means had merged into something monstrous and no longer distinguishable from each other. So Mairon, now beginning to be called Gorthor by the elves, the cruel, took his place at Morgoth's side. And if you can believe it, he was not unhappy there, not at first, because for a long time he was extraordinarily effective. He was, in many ways, the administrative genius behind Morgoth's realm. Where Morgoth was vast and chaotic and given to grand gestures of destruction, Mairon was precise and methodical and deeply competent. He organized, he coordinated, he ran the dark fortress of Angband like a masterwork of terrible efficiency. Orcs were bred and trained, wolves were nurtured into things of nightmare, dragons were brought into the world and set to their terrible purposes. And all of it ran, in its awful way, like clockwork, because Mairon was there, making sure it did. This was the age of the world known as the First Age, dear traveler, though in those early years before even the awakening of the elves, it had not yet formally begun. We are speaking of the years of the lamps, and then the years of the trees, those long epochs before the sun and moon were made, when the world was lit by the great lamps of the Valar, and later by the two trees of Valinor, Telperion the silver and Laurelin the gold, whose light was unlike anything that came after, softer, older, more like a memory of light than light itself. And then came the first great catastrophe. Morgoth, with the help of the terrible spider creature Ungoliant, destroyed the two trees. Their light was extinguished, drunk up by darkness and hunger, and for a time the world was plunged into a cold and terrible dark. It was in this darkness that the Silmarils, the three great jewels crafted by the elf Feanor, which had captured the last light of the trees within their crystalline depths, became the most precious things in all the world, and Morgoth naturally stole them. He set them in his iron crown and wore them always, though they burned him to touch, and this burning was a torment he accepted because possession was worth any pain. It was the theft of the Silmarils and the murder of the elf lord Finwë that set the First Age properly in motion, for it brought the Noldor, those proud and brilliant high elves, out of the blessed realm of Valinor and back into Middle-earth in pursuit of Morgoth and in oath-bound determination to recover what had been stolen. And it was in this context that Mairon, Gawthor, showed his full worth to his master. For the wars that followed, the long and terrible conflict between the Noldor and the forces of Morgoth, were fought with every tool at Morgoth's disposal, and many of those tools were crafted or wielded by Sauron. Take a slow breath now, dear traveler. We are moving into the great sweep of the First Age. Those countless years of war and beauty and sorrow and heroism that Tolkien told in the Silmarillion. You don't need to follow every name, every battle. Just let the shape of it settle over you like a quiet landscape seen from a great height. Green valleys and dark mountains, the gleam of elven swords in moonlight, the glow of Angband on the horizon like a false dawn. Among Sauron's most notable roles during the First Age was his mastery of Tolkien, the Isle of Werewolves. This was a fortress on an island in the middle of the River Sirion, a place of deep strategic importance in that age's geography. It had originally been built by the elf lord Finrod Felagund as a watchtower called Minas Tirith, not to be confused with the later city of Men in the Third Age, but an earlier stronghold of that name. Morgoth's forces conquered it, and Sauron took it for his own, transforming it into a place of horror and dark sorcery. He kept werewolves there, great wolves of terrible power, and he himself was a shapeshifter, able to take many forms: wolf, serpent, vampire, a terrible dark presence that could unmake the will of those who faced him. And here is a story, dear traveler, that shows us Sauron as he was in the First Age, in a confrontation that is at once deeply frightening and deeply beautiful, because it is ultimately a story of love and courage and the limits of what dark power can do against a devoted heart. Beren was a mortal man, one of the Edain, the noble men who allied with the elves against Morgoth, and he loved Luthien Tinuviel, the daughter of Thingol, king of Doriath, and Melian the Maiar. Luthien was perhaps the most beautiful being who ever walked in Middle-earth, and she had power in her song that went beyond what most elves could imagine, for she was half Maiar, the daughter of a divine being, and her gifts were extraordinary. Beren had promised to bring Thingol, one of the Silmarils, from Morgoth's crown as the bride price for Luthien, an impossible task set to drive him away, because what man could do such a thing? But Beren did not give up, and when he was captured, when his companions were taken and devoured one by one in the dungeons of Tolkien, it was Luthien herself who came for him, with Huan, the great hound of Valinor who had been given to the elf lord Celegorm. The confrontation between Luthien and Sauron is one of the great moments of the First Age. Sauron sent wolf after wolf against Huan, but each was defeated, until at last Sauron himself took the form of a great wolf and went to face the hound, and Huan defeated even Sauron in that form, pinning him to the ground with terrible strength. And Sauron, caught and helpless, offered to yield the tower to Luthien if she would release him, and she did, though the tower fell into ruin as he fled. He fled in the form of a vampire, a creature of shadow and blood, to the darkness of Taur Nufuin, the forest under nightshade, and he lurked there for a time, diminished but not destroyed. This is important, dear traveler. Sauron was not destroyed here. He was defeated, humiliated, driven away, but he endured, because the nature of Maiar and of Ainur in general is not easily ended. The physical form might be lost or injured, but the spirit persists. Sauron would have to be defeated in a very particular way to be truly ended, and even then certain things would have to be done that, in the First Age, no one quite knew how to do, and so he lurked and waited and served his master. The First Age concluded in a cataclysm so vast that it reshaped the very geography of the world. Morgoth, whose power had been diminishing through the long wars but who still held the 3 Silmarils and the fortress of Angband, was finally brought to bay. The Valar themselves, those divine beings who had largely stayed out of the conflicts in Middle-earth, partly out of respect for the free will of elves and men, finally came forth in what is called the War of Wrath. The armies of the West, Valar and Maiar and elves of Valinor, descended upon Morgoth's realm with irresistible force. Angband was broken open. The dragons were slain or scattered. The armies of Morgoth were utterly overthrown, and Morgoth was thrust out through the door of night, beyond the walls of the world, into the outer darkness, the void beyond Ardor itself. He was defeated in a way that seemed utterly final, and with him, theoretically, should have gone his influence over the world. But the corruption he had spread could not simply be removed. The world had been marred. The darkness he had seeded in the hearts of men and of some elves, and in the very nature of things, that remained. And his greatest servant, Sauron, had escaped the war of wrath. Whether he hid or fled, or simply was not found in the chaos of that enormous conflict, the records are not entirely clear. But Sauron was not brought before the Valar in the aftermath of Morgoth's defeat. He was not bound. He was not sent into exile. And so, as the First Age ended, and the Second Age of the world began, as the great island of Númenor rose from the sea as a gift to the men who had aided in Morgoth's defeat, and as the elves who remained in Middle-earth settled into their kingdoms among the trees and the rivers, Sauron was loose in the world, diminished perhaps, disconnected from his master, but still possessed of all his knowledge, all his craft, all his terrible intelligence, and patience and hunger for order. For a time, dear traveler, and this is one of the most interesting aspects of the lore, it seems that Sauron genuinely considered surrendering, or something close to it. After Morgoth's fall, the herald of the Valar, the great Maiar called upon all of Morgoth's servants to come forth and be judged, and Sauron, it is said, came to Ernwë and appeared to repent. He offered submission. He acknowledged that what he had done was wrong. But here is the catch. Ernwë did not have the authority to pardon Sauron. That was a judgment that would have to be made by the Valar themselves, and to receive it, Sauron would have had to journey back to Valinor, to the Blessed Realm, and stand before them in humility and accept whatever judgment they deemed appropriate. And that final step, that genuine laying down of himself before a power greater than his own, that willingness to be small, Sauron could not do. The shame was too great, the pride that had always lived in him, that love of his own excellence and his own judgment, reared up and said, "No, not that, not humility in front of those who would define my worth and limit my power, not that." And so he withdrew. He hid himself in Middle-earth, and slowly, in the darkness of his concealment, what might have been genuine repentance curdled back into something far worse. Because by refusing the judgment that might have healed him, by choosing pride over humility, he closed off the path back. He became, in a sense, committed to his darkness, not by love of darkness, but by inability to face the light. Breathe slowly, dear traveler. That is such a deeply human thing, isn't it? The inability to admit fault, to ask for help, to endure the necessary humiliation of being corrected by a wisdom greater than your own. It is among the most human of all failures, even in one who is not human at all. And so the Second Age began, and Sauron moved in secret, gathering his strength, reconsidering his position and his goals. He had served Morgoth, but Morgoth was gone now, and Sauron had never truly shared Morgoth's love of destruction for its own sake. What Sauron wanted was dominion, control, the perfected order that he had always craved, and now without a master, he could pursue that goal on his own terms. The question was, how? Morgoth's approach had been brute force, vast armies, terrible monsters, open war, and it had failed, catastrophically, utterly failed. The forces of the West were too powerful to be overcome by sheer might, at least not now, not when the Valar themselves might intervene. Sauron needed a different strategy, and so he turned to subtlety, to craft, to the particular genius that had always been his greatest gift. For a long time in the early Second Age, Sauron remained in the east of Middle-earth, in regions largely unknown to the elves of the West. He built up his power quietly, made himself the ruler of men in those eastern lands who had no tradition of resistance to Morgoth's shadow, and who were easily drawn to a being of such power and apparent wisdom. He began to be worshipped. He took a new name, or rather the name was given to him, and he accepted it. Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. Now this name is the key to everything that happened next. because it captures perfectly the nature of Sauron's great deception in the Second Age. He would not come as a conqueror, he would come as a benefactor. He would come offering knowledge, craft, wisdom, gifts freely given, or so it would appear, and through those gifts he would bind the recipients to his will. The elves of Middle-earth in the Second Age were a remarkable people. The great kingdoms of the First Age were largely gone. Beleriand itself had been swallowed by the sea in the cataclysm of the War of Wrath. But the elves who remained had built new realms, Lindon in the far west, ruled by Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, Eregion, the land of the elven smiths, the Gwaithai Myrdan, who worked wonders of craft in the shadow of the misty mountains, and Khazad-dûm, the great dwarf kingdom in the depths of those same mountains, where Durin's folk had delved deep and found mithril and forged miracles of their own. Sauron, in his guise as Annatar, came to the elven smiths of Eredin. And this, dear traveller, is where the story of the Rings of Power truly begins. That tale which echoes through the rest of Tolkien's world, like a bell that, once struck, can never fully stop ringing. Eredin was led by Celebrimbor, grandson of Fëanor, inheritor of the greatest craftsman's blood in the history of the elves, possessed of a talent for making things that bordered on the miraculous. Celebrimbor was passionate about his craft in the way that only the truly gifted can be, utterly devoted, almost reckless in his love of the work itself. He wanted to make, he wanted to discover, he wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible. And Annatar, Sauron in disguise, came to him speaking the language of craft, speaking of new techniques, of the marriage of elvish skill with deeper knowledge of the hidden properties of materials and forces. He came offering exactly what Celebrimbor most desired, a path forward in the art of making. Not all the elves were deceived. Gil-galad, the High King, refused to allow Annatar entrance to Lindon. Something in his instinct warned him away from this too smooth, too helpful stranger. Elrond, who had begun his long residence in Middle-earth, and whose wisdom was deep even then, shared this wariness. They sent word to Eregion to be careful, to question, to not simply trust. But Celebrimbor wanted to believe, and in some ways, it must be said, what Annatar was offering was real. The knowledge was genuine, the techniques worked, rings were made, lesser rings at first, objects of craft and power, but not of domination. And working alongside this brilliant, persuasive teacher, Celebrimbor and the Gwaithai Myrdan achieved things they might never have achieved alone. The craft advanced, the knowledge deepened, and the trust, such as it was, grew. And then came the great work. Under Annatar's guidance, the elven smiths of Eredin created the Rings of Power. 16 rings, great and small, each one an achievement of craft that went beyond anything previously made. 7 for the dwarf lords, 9 for mortal men. These were rings made with Sauron's knowledge threaded through them, but they were made by elvish hands, and they carried in them the particular genius of the Noldor. But Sauron had a plan within a plan, dear traveller, a deepest layer of his deception that Celebrimbor did not know. Even as the rings were being made, Sauron secretly withdrew to his own dark realm, to Mordor, which he had already chosen and begun to prepare as his seat of power, that volcanic land of ash and shadow at the southeastern corner of the world. And there in the fires of Mount Doom, Orodruin, the mountain of fate, he forged something else, something that those who had made the lesser rings could not have imagined and had not been told of. He forged the One Ring, and into that ring, into its molten gold, into the very substance of its making, into every precise and terrible minute of its crafting, he poured something extraordinary and terrible, a portion of his own power, his own will, his own fundamental essence as a being. The One Ring was not merely an object of great power in the ordinary sense. It was, in a very real way, a piece of Sauron himself. It was linked to him more deeply than anything else in the world, bound to his life and his continuation and his ability to function. And it was designed with a single, specific purpose: to dominate the other rings. For Sauron had written into the lesser rings, without their makers knowing, threads of power that could be reached, could be grasped, could be commanded by the One. The bearers of those other rings would feel the One's call. Their wills would bend toward the will of the ring's master. They would be, in the end, not truly free. And when he slipped the one ring onto his finger, the elves of Eredin felt something change. Immediately, in that first moment of the ring's full power, they understood. They heard, as it were, his voice, sensed his will reaching out through the network of rings he had designed, and they knew instantly what had been done. They knew they had been deceived. They took off their rings. They refused to be dominated. Celebrimbor, in particular, was furious, mortified, betrayed in the deepest possible way, not just politically, but creatively, in his most sacred work, which had been used as a tool against everything he valued. He refused to give Sauron the rings. He hid the three greatest rings, the three elven rings that he had made privately, without Sauron's direct guidance, though still with some of the knowledge Sauron had given him. He hid them where Sauron could not find them, and he sent them away, and he prepared to resist. He failed, dear traveler. The war that followed was swift and devastating. Sauron's armies swept over Eredin with terrible force. The beautiful city of Ostin-Edhil was destroyed. The Gwaith y Myrdain was slaughtered or scattered, and Celebrimbor himself, grandson of Fëanor, the greatest craftsman of his age, was captured and tormented by Sauron, who desperately wanted to know where the three great elven rings were hidden. He endured great suffering, and in the end they used his body as a banner, carrying it on a pole at the head of their armies. He never told. The three elven rings remained hidden. Let that rest in your heart for a moment, dear traveler. Let the quiet courage of that gesture settle in the darkness around you. In the midst of all of Sauron's craft and power and deception, there was this, a craftsman who chose suffering over betrayal and who kept his secret until the end. But the war did not end with Eredin's fall. In the north, forces from Lindon fought back. In the south, a fleet arrived from Númenor. And this is where we must turn our attention, because the story of Númenor and its relationship with Sauron is one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking threads in all of Tolkien's mythology. Númenor. Let the word sit in your mind like a stone dropped into still water, dear traveler. Númenor, the western land, the gift of the Valar to the men who had stood against Morgoth, raised from the sea in the shape of a five-pointed star, lying in the great sea between the shores of Middle-earth and the distant blessed realm of Valinor, a land of extraordinary beauty and richness, where men lived for hundreds of years, grew wise and strong and tall, built great fleets that sailed the seas, and were perhaps the closest that mortal men ever came to matching the elves in grace and knowledge. The Númenóreans were the Dúnedain, the men of the West, and in the early Second Age they were good and noble, and their kings were wise. They could not come to Valinor itself, for that was forbidden to them by the ban of the Valar, a prohibition that would eventually, like all prohibitions, become the thing most desired. But they could sail to the shores of Middle-earth, and they did, and they helped the elves in their wars against Sauron, and they were honored and loved. But as the centuries of the Second Age wore on, something began to change in Númenor. The shadow of the ban grew darker in the hearts of its people. They began to resent the one thing withheld from them, the undying lands, immortality, the deathlessness that the elves possessed. They began to fear death, not just as a thing to be delayed, but as an offense, an injustice, a wrong. And as this resentment grew, the kings of Númenor grew more proud and more grasping, less friendly to the elves and to the Valar, more focused on their own power and glory. By the middle of the Second Age, Númenor was the greatest power in the world. Its fleets commanded the seas, its armies could scatter any enemy in Middle-earth, and its kings, now firmly in what would come to be called the Black Years of their dynasty, had turned entirely away from the elves and from the friendship of the West. This was the situation when the Númenorian king, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the last and greatest and most terrible of the Númenorian kings, arrived on the shores of Middle-earth with a fleet so vast it darkened the harbor. He had come to challenge Sauron directly, because Sauron, emboldened by his victories and his dominion over so many lesser peoples, had been calling himself Lord of Middle-earth and King of Men, and the Númenorians were not inclined to let that stand. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary moments in the Second Age, and it is a testament to how thoroughly Sauron could think through a long and complex plan. Sauron looked at the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn, and he looked at his own armies, and he realized something. He could not win this battle by force. Not now. Not against this. The Númenorians were simply too powerful, so he surrendered. Willingly, voluntarily, he came before Ar-Pharazôn and submitted himself as a hostage. He allowed himself to be taken to Númenor. Think about that for a moment, dear traveler. Think about what it means. Sauron, who had spent the entire Second Age building his power, who had forged the One Ring and commanded vast armies and brought down kingdoms, he walked into captivity voluntarily because he had seen something in Ar-Pharazôn and in Númenor that he recognized, that he knew how to use. The pride, the fear, the resentment of death, the turning away from the Valar. He had seen the lever, and he knew exactly where to place his hand. Within 3 years of arriving in Númenor, he had become the king's chief counselor. Within a handful more years, he had temples built to Morgoth. Morgoth, his old master, the one whose name the Númenorians had always feared as the greatest evil. Sauron began preaching a theology that Morgoth was not evil, but the true lord of the world, and that death was not Eru's gift, but Eru's punishment, and that there was power enough in Morgoth's service to overcome death itself, to claim the immortality that the Valar selfishly withheld. And people believed him. Not all. There were the faithful, those Númenorians who remained loyal to the old ways and to friendship with the elves and the Valar. But enough, more than enough. The shadow deepened year by year. The smoke of sacrificial fires rose from the new temple. Men who belonged to the faithful were burned alive on its altars. Númenor, which had once been one of the glories of the world, became a place of fear and darkness, and Sauron sat at the center of it like a spider at the center of a web, patient, deliberate, his eyes always on the next step in the long plan. The final step was this. Sauron told Ar-Pharazôn that the key to immortality lay in Valinor itself, that if the king would only be bold enough, powerful enough, prideful enough, if he would defy the ban and sail west to the undying lands, he might take immortality by force. Ar-Pharazôn built the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. He called it the Great Armament, and he sailed west. He reached Valinor. He set foot on its shores, and then Eru Ilúvatar himself acted directly for one of only a handful of times in the history of the world. Because what Ar-Pharazôn had done was not merely bold or proud or foolish. It was a fundamental violation of the order of things, an attempt to seize by force what could never be taken, to grasp the immortality that is not given to mortal men. Eru changed the very shape of the world. The sea opened. The great fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was swallowed. Ar-Pharazôn and his army were buried under the falling hills of Valinor, trapped in a cave in the earth until the last battle at the end of time. Númenor itself was destroyed, swallowed by the sea in a cataclysm so complete, so total, that nothing of the island remained above the water. The entire land simply vanished, taking most of its people with it, and the world was changed in its very shape. Before Númenor's fall, Arda had been a flat world, and you could, in theory, sail to the undying lands if you went far enough west. After the fall, Valinor was removed from the physical world. It was bent away so that mortal ships sailing west would find only the horizon receding before them and eventually return to where they started. The world became round. The straight road to the west became something that only elves and certain of the diminishing race of elf friends could walk. Now, Sauron was in Númenor when it fell, dear traveler. His physical body, the fair form he had crafted and maintained during his time as Annatar, and then as the Counselor of Kings, was destroyed in the cataclysm. He had not been able to foresee this exact outcome, perhaps. Or perhaps he had, but had miscalculated the precision of Eru's response. Or perhaps he had not cared, had judged that even this price was worth paying because, with Númenor gone, the greatest obstacle to his dominion over Middle-earth was removed. Either way, he had paid a cost that was steeper than he perhaps intended, the loss of his ability to take a fair physical form ever again. In the years that followed, when he reformed himself in Middle-earth, for his spirit could not be destroyed, only his body. He took a form that was dark and terrible and clearly malevolent. The fair face, the warm voice, the persuasive beauty of Anatar, those were gone. He could still be imposing, but he could no longer be beautiful. He could no longer deceive, at least not in the old way, through appearance. But he still had the One Ring. He had taken it from Mordor to Númenor with him and had it still, and with it the power to dominate the other rings. The 9, the rings given to mortal men, had done their work. Those men, kings, sorcerers, lords of great power and ambition, had accepted the rings and been gradually, inexorably changed. Their natural lifespan was stretched beyond all mortal bounds, but it was not immortality. It was more like a gradual fading, a thinning, a loss of substance. They became shadows. They became the Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths, the Ulairi, utterly bound to Sauron's will, their own identities swallowed by the ring's power, preserved in a state that was neither life nor death, neither real nor gone. 9 terrible spectral riders, cloaked in black, serving their master with the absolute devotion of those who have no will left to refuse. Of the 7 dwarf rings, Sauron eventually recovered 3, and the others were destroyed by dragons over the long years. The dwarves had proven less susceptible to the rings than men. Their nature was harder, more material, more resistant to the particular kind of corruption the rings intended. They became rich beyond imagining, their hoards enormous, their ambitions correspondingly vast. But they did not become shadow servants. They did not fade. The rings worked differently on them, and ultimately did not give Sauron the control over the dwarves he had desired. The 3 elven rings, Narya, Nenya, Vilya, remained hidden and unused. They had been made by Celebrimbor without direct participation from Sauron, and while his knowledge had gone into their making, they were not tools of his domination in the same way. But as long as the One Ring existed, they were not fully free either. Their power functioned independently, yes, but they operated always within the shadow of the One, and their bearers were never entirely outside Sauron's reach as long as he held the Master Ring. So now it was the latter part of the Second Age, dear traveller, and the board was set. Sauron, reformed in terrible shape in Mordor, with the One Ring and the 9 ring-wraiths, turned his attention once more to Middle-earth. The time for subtlety had passed, at least for now. He moved openly. He marched. He took the city of Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, built by the Númenorians who had fled the destruction of their homeland and settled in Middle-earth as the Dunedain of the south. These survivors, led by Elendil the Tall and his sons Anarion and Isildur, had established the realm of Gondor in the south and Arnor in the north, and they had built Minas Ithil and Minas Anor as great towers of their new kingdom. Sauron took Minas Ithil and held it, and it became Minas Morgul in later ages, the Tower of Sorcery, a place of cold dread. But this was too much. It drew a response that Sauron had perhaps not fully anticipated. The last alliance of elves and men, Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, joined with Elendil of Gondor, and together they assembled an army of such power and unity that it had not been seen since the War of Wrath. This was the last alliance, the final great act of cooperation between elves and men against a common enemy, the moment that closed the Second Age and made possible everything in the Third. They marched to Mordor. They fought the terrible Battle of Dagorlad on the plain before the Black Gate, and won. They pushed into Mordor itself, and Sauron came out to meet them on the slopes of Mount Doom. The siege of Barad-dûr, Sauron's great fortress, lasted 7 years. 7 years of grinding, terrible war in the ashen wastelands of Mordor. The casualties were enormous, the suffering was beyond measure, but the alliance held, and at the end of 7 years the fortress fell, and Sauron himself came forth. He was terrible, a dark lord in full, enormous and devastating, clothed in power that was immense even now. He slew Gil-galad with his own hand. He slew Elendil. Both of those great leaders fell in direct combat with Sauron, their power not enough to overcome him individually. And then Isildur, Elendil's son, Elendil, who had just died before his eyes. Isildur took up his father's broken sword, Narsil, and used the shard to cut the one ring from Sauron's hand, and Sauron's body failed. Without the ring, the physical form he had labored to maintain simply could not hold together. He fell. He dissolved into something formless, a dark spirit that scattered on the wind, and the dominion he had built over Middle-earth collapsed immediately, as if a cord had been severed that held everything together. The ring-wraiths fled or faded. The armies of Mordor scattered. The dark tower was left empty and broken. It was over, or so it seemed. Isildur, dear traveler, did not destroy the ring. He looked at it lying in the battlefield dust, and it was still beautiful, still gold, still warm to the touch, with that faint inner fire that never quite extinguished. And something in Isildur, call it pride, call it grief, call it the ring's own subtle will, already at work even in the absence of its master, said, "This is mine, this is my price of revenge. This is the Were-Guild for my father. I will keep it." Elrond was there. Elrond urged him to destroy it. The mountain was right there, Mount Doom, whose fires were the only place in all the world where the ring could be unmade, because those fires were the fires of its making. But Isildur said no, and took the ring and walked away. 2 years later, at the crossing of the Gladden Fields, Isildur and his company were ambushed by orcs. In the confusion of battle, Isildur put on the ring to escape, and the ring betrayed him, slipping from his finger into the river Anduin as he swam. The ring fell into the riverbed, into the silt and cold dark water, and Isildur, suddenly visible to the orc archers on the bank, was shot. He died there in the water. The second age was over. The third age began, and Sauron, somewhere in the darkness, formless, stripped of physical existence, separated from the one ring he needed to anchor his power, waited. Take a slow, easy breath now, dear listener. We have come a long way already through the vast darkness of the Elder Ages. The world has been remade. Great kingdoms have risen and fallen. Light has been extinguished and rekindled, and through it all, a single thread of will and hunger has persisted, refusing to be truly ended. Feel the weight of that story settle around you like the quiet of deep stone, like the hush of a riverbed in the dark. For much of the early Third Age, Sauron was nothing, not nothing in the philosophical sense. His spirit still existed, still had will, still had the desire for dominion and the memory of everything he had been. But without his physical form, and more importantly, without the One Ring, he was powerless to act in any meaningful way. He was a ghost of himself, a whisper. He could perhaps influence others, perhaps corrupt willing hearts in small ways, perhaps nudge and suggest and whisper in the dark places, but nothing more. The ring was lost, lying in the river Anduin, and the world for a time breathed more easily. Gondor thrived. Arna continued, though it would eventually face its own troubles. The elves maintained their realms. The dwarves delved deep. The Ents walked their forests. And in the Shire, far to the north, a people called the Hobbits, small, unpretentious, devoted to peace and pipeweed and a good meal, lived out their cheerful existence, largely unaware that the history of the world had anything to do with them. It would be wrong to say the Third Age was peaceful. Shadows grew in the east and the south. Arna was eventually broken, partly through the machinations of a terrible figure called the Witch King of Angmar, who was, though few in the north realized it at the time, the chief of the Nazgul, the Lord of the Ring-Wraiths, one of Sauron's most terrible servants, acting even without Sauron's full presence to direct him. The Witch King destroyed Arna, killed the last of its kings, and then vanished when the armies of Gondor and the horsemen of the Eotheod came against him. And then, after perhaps 1,000 years of virtual absence from the world, 1,000 years, something began to stir again. In the year 1000 of the Third Age, a presence began to be felt in the dark forest of Greenwood the Great. A sickness spread through the forest, turning it from the bright woodland it had been to something darker and more threatening, and the forest acquired a new name, Mirkwood. And at the southern end of Mirkwood, in a place called Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, something powerful and malevolent took up residence. The wise called this presence the Necromancer, for it seemed to have power over the dead and the undead, and its exact nature was unknown for a very long time. Gandalf, who had come to Middle-earth with the other Istari roughly around this same period, as an emissary of the Valar in response to the growing shadow, eventually went to investigate. He found a darkness there, but could not identify it with certainty. He went again later, and this time he penetrated the fortress and discovered the truth. The necromancer was Sauron. Sauron gathering his strength in secret, building himself slowly back towards something like his former power over the span of centuries. It was also in this period of investigation that Gandalf, searching the dungeons of Dol Guldur, found the ancient dwarf lord Thrain the Sendu, who had been captured and was kept there in misery and madness. Thrain had possessed one of the 7 dwarf rings, and a key and a map. The last of these items he managed to press into Gandalf's hands before he died there in that dark place. That key and that map would eventually find their way to Thorin Oakenshield, and would lead to the journey described in The Hobbit, and would result in events that set the stage for the War of the Ring. But that is a thread for another night, perhaps. For now, let us keep our eyes on Sauron, the White Council, the great council of the wise, led by Saruman the White, who was himself a Maiar, one of the 5 Istari sent to Middle-earth, and including Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond and others, met and debated what to do about the necromancer of Dol Guldur. Gandalf urged action, urged that they should drive the necromancer out before he could consolidate his power further. Saruman, for reasons we will touch on shortly, counseled delay, eventually in 2941 of the Third Age. The same year, interestingly, that Bilbo Baggins found the One Ring in Gollum's cave. The White Council finally drove Sauron from Dol Guldur, but it was too late to catch him, or perhaps not even a genuine attempt. Sauron, who had been preparing for exactly this possibility, simply withdrew. He had been gathering strength for 1,000 years. He had done what he needed to do, and now he went, openly, back to Mordor. The return of the shadow had begun. In 2951, Sauron openly declared himself in Mordor. He sent 3 of the Nazgul to reoccupy Dol Guldur. He began rebuilding Barad-dûr. He began gathering armies. He sent out the ring wraiths in search of the One Ring. He put into motion every plan he had been quietly preparing for centuries, and he did it with a speed and efficiency that reflected how much more ready he was than anyone had realized. And here is where we must speak of what Sauron knew and did not know. He knew the ring had been lost in the Anduin. He knew it had not been destroyed. He believed, with good reason, given how long it had lain dormant without being found, that it might never be found at all, or that it might take him a very long time to locate it. But he also knew that he could rebuild a significant portion of his power without the ring over enough time, and that was what he had been doing. What he did not know in those years of rebuilding was that the ring had been found, first by a riverbank creature called Deagol, who was immediately murdered for it by his cousin Smeagol, that Smeagol who would spend the next 5 centuries in the cold dark beneath the misty mountains talking to himself and eating raw fish and going quite thoroughly mad in the most pitiful way imaginable, becoming Gollum. And then by Bilbo Baggins, who had found the ring in the dark of that same cave and had brought it home to the Shire, not knowing what it was. Sauron, when he became aware that his ring had been found and that it was in the possession of a hobbit in the Shire, this is a moment we can only imagine, but it must have been electric, because the ring was within reach. The key to his full restoration was somewhere in a small, green, peaceful land in the northwest corner of Middle-earth. All he needed to do was reach out and take it. He sent the Nazgul, all 9 of them eventually, but initially 3, and then 9 all riding together. The 9 riders, the Black Riders, the ring wraiths on their terrible horses, spreading fear before them as they rode. They went to the Shire. They asked for Baggins. They missed Frodo, who had already set off with the ring, guided by Gandalf's urgent counsel, by the narrowest of margins, again and again, until the chase culminated in the desperate ride to Rivendell and the crossing of the ford of Bruinen, where Elrond's power over the river swept the pursuing Nazgûl away. The Council of Elrond was held, the Fellowship of the Ring was formed. Frodo volunteered to take the ring to Mordor and destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom. 9 companions set out from Rivendell, 1 hobbit as ring-bearer, 3 hobbit companions, 1 wizard, 1 elf, 1 dwarf, and 2 men, one of them Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, the last of the royal line of the Dúnedain, who would either reclaim the throne of Gondor or fail in the attempt. But before we follow that journey, dear traveler, I want to linger for a moment in Mordor itself, in the mind and the plans of the one who sat in the Dark Tower and reached out with his perception across the miles, searching, always searching, because Sauron in the War of the Ring is a fascinating figure, powerful beyond easy description, yes, but also, crucially, not omniscient. He had enormous strength, he had the ring wraiths and armies, and the terror of his name. But he had blind spots. He had assumptions that would prove fatal. The great assumption was this, that anyone who possessed the One Ring would use it. That was what he would have done. That was what any being of power would do. The ring was the ultimate weapon. You picked it up, and you claimed it, and you wielded it against your enemies. He could not fully credit the idea that anyone would try to destroy it. That was so alien to his nature, so contrary to everything he valued, that he couldn't quite hold it as a genuine possibility. He knew in some intellectual sense that it was the one thing that could truly end him. But to throw away the greatest possible weapon, to march into the very heart of his domain, not to conquer, but to destroy, that went against every principle of power that Sauron had ever known. And so his eye was turned outward. He was watching the great movements of armies, watching Aragorn, who had revealed himself by using the Palantir, the ancient seeing stone, in Orthanc, and who Sauron knew was the heir of Isildur. Sauron believed, because it fit his understanding of the world, that Aragorn would try to use the ring, would use it to challenge him directly, would come as a rival Dark Lord with the ring in hand. And so Sauron poured his attention and his armies toward that threat, toward the visible, comprehensible, expected challenge. He did not sufficiently attend to 2 small figures picking their way through the wastes of his own realm, guided by a mad, wretched, scheming creature who called himself Gollum. But let us not skip ahead too quickly, dear listener. There is so much more of the War of the Ring to sit with, so many pieces of the story that illuminate who and what Sauron was and what he had built. Let the story breathe. We should speak of Saruman, because Saruman is in some ways a dark mirror of Sauron, and understanding that reflection tells us something important. Saruman the White, Curanir in Elvish, the man of skill, was himself a Maiar, sent to Middle-earth as one of the 5 Istari, roughly 2,000 years into the Third Age. His particular gifts were for craft and mechanism, and persuasion. He was the head of the White Council, the leader of the wizards, and he was genuinely brilliant. But Saruman had studied the Rings of Power too deeply, had become too fascinated with Sauron's methods, and somewhere in the long centuries of his study had begun to believe that the methods could be separated from the master, that one could use Sauron's tools without becoming Sauron's servant. He built his own version of Sauron's plan, a ring of his own design, armies of his own, a great industrial fortress at Isengard, where he bred Uruk-hai, a more powerful strain of orc who did not fear daylight. He even believed for a time that if the One Ring surfaced, he might be the one to claim it, and with it challenge Sauron directly and replace him. This is precisely the same error of reasoning that Sauron had made at the beginning of his own fall. The idea that power is a neutral tool, that if I use it for my purposes, then it serves my ends. But power doesn't work that way in Tolkien's world. The ring had a will of its own, Sauron's will in a very literal sense, and no one who used it would be able to hold on to their own purposes for long. They would become Sauron, or they would be destroyed. There was no third option. Saruman ended as a petty, bitter, diminished thing, driven from Isengard, humiliated by Ents, stripped of his power by Gandalf and eventually reduced to tormenting a small shire in a last attempt to feel some shadow of control. It is almost unbearably sad. A being of immense gifts reduced to spite and petty malice because he chose to emulate the Dark Lord he claimed to oppose. But we digress into Saruman's story, only to illuminate Sauron's. Let us return. The War of the Ring unfolded on multiple fronts simultaneously, which was itself a testament to how thoroughly Sauron had organized his campaign. His plan was not to strike from a single direction, but to overwhelm the defenses of the West from every angle at once. The forces of Mordor would attack Gondor directly. The forces of Rohan would be neutralized by Saruman. At least, that was the plan before Saruman's defeat at Helm's Deep and the destruction of Isengard by the Ents. The Easterlings and the Haradrim and the corsairs of Umbar would come from east and south. Dol Guldur's forces would strike at the elves, and the Nazgul would hunt the ring-bearer. It very nearly worked. Gondor's situation by the time of the siege of Minas Tirith was desperate. The White City, beacon of the south, was surrounded by an army of such size that the plain before its walls was black with enemies and red with fire. The great battering ram Grond, named for the weapon of Morgoth himself, a gesture so deliberate it chills the blood, broke the great gate. The Witch King rode in, claiming that no living man could stand against him, and for a moment it seemed as if everything would fall. And then Éowyn and Merry, the shield maiden of Rohan, and the hobbit of the Shire, not men, not any of the categories the prophecy had accounted for. They faced the Lord of the Nazgul, the greatest of Sauron's servants, the most terrible of the ring-wraiths, and they unmade him between them. Éowyn's blade found the crown of the Witch King's hood, and he dissolved, and the ancient prophecy of Glorfindel, not by the hand of man will he fall, was fulfilled in the most unexpected and perfect way imaginable. But even this great victory was not enough on its own. The armies of Mordor had not been defeated, only checked, and Frodo and Sam were still making their slow, agonizing way through the wastelands, with Gollum as their guide and the ring growing heavier with every step. The strategy Aragorn and Gandalf adopted next was itself a kind of desperate gamble. Or was it wisdom? The host of the West marched to the Black Gate of Mordor and challenged Sauron directly. Not because they could win such a battle, they couldn't. It was hopeless from a purely military standpoint. But it would do two things. It would draw Sauron's eye, and it would draw out his armies from around Mount Doom, clearing the path for the ring-bearer. This is where Sauron's greatest weakness became his undoing. Because when he looked out from the eye, that great, lidless, burning eye atop Barad-dûr that saw everywhere and everything, and saw Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, marching to his very gate, he did not think, what is the small thing I'm not watching? He thought, the ring-bearer is using the ring through Aragorn as a puppet. He thought, Aragorn has the ring and is trying to challenge me directly. He saw the expected threat, the comprehensible threat, the threat that aligned with his own understanding of how power works. And so he sent everything. He poured his armies out through the gate to destroy the host of the West. The sky darkened. The eagle-like winged Nazgul circled overhead. The armies of Mordor covered the plain like a tide, and in Gorgoroth, in the smoking wasteland below Mount Doom, two small figures reached the Samath Naur, the chambers of fire, the very place where the ring had been forged. Frodo, dear traveler, did not destroy the ring. He could not. After everything, the months of journey, the weight of the ring, the slow erosion of his will and his self, he stood at the edge of the fire and claimed it. He put it on his finger. He declared it his own. And Gollum, wretched, mad, treacherous, devoted Gollum, who had followed them every step, who had been dealt with in kindness and in anger and in pity, who had been used as a guide and betrayed them to Shelob's lair, who loved the ring with every atom of his tattered being. Gollum bit the finger from Frodo's hand. He took the ring. He danced in triumph on the edge of the precipice, and then he fell. The ring fell into the fire of Orodruin, and Sauron felt it go. This is a moment I want to linger on, dear traveler, because it is one of the most profound moments in all of Tolkien's work, and I think you can sit with it quietly in the dark tonight as you drift towards sleep. Imagine what it must have felt like to Sauron in that instant. He had poured so much of himself into that ring, his power, his will, his very essence. It was not merely an object of enormous magical potency. It was, in a very real sense, the most intimate thing in all the world for him. And in the moment that it was destroyed, everything that he was, everything he had ever been or done or aspired to, came crashing down. The physical form he had laboriously rebuilt dissolved utterly. The last of his power departed from the world. The ring-wraiths, who were in the air above the battle at the Black Gate, screamed one terrible scream and were unmade. Their sustaining power gone, their tenuous existence finally ended. The armies of Mordor broke and fled, or surrendered in confusion, leaderless, purposeless. Barad-dûr fell, the tower that had stood for an age of the world, built from the greatest engineering of Sauron's mind, crumbled and fell into darkness. And Sauron was gone. But was he really? This is a question worth sitting with. In Tolkien's mythology, the permanent destruction of a Maiar's spirit is not something that happens easily or automatically. What happened to Sauron at the end of the War of the Ring is described as a final diminishment, a waning so great that he could never again recover the power to take form, never again rise to meaningful action in the world. He was not annihilated in the way that, say, a mortal creature might be destroyed. His spirit persisted in some form, but it was stripped of so much, so fundamentally reduced, so utterly broken by the destruction of the thing that had held his greatest power, that it was effectively the end. Tolkien wrote in various places that after the destruction of the One Ring, Sauron's power was so reduced that he became a very minor, whisper-thin thing, present perhaps as a vague malice in the world, like a bruise that slowly heals, but never again capable of gathering the will or the shape or the force to threaten anyone. He would dwindle, he would fade, not into nothing exactly. Tolkien did not commit to the idea of total annihilation, but into something so small and dispersed and impotent as to be effectively nothing. The great wheel of his existence had finally stopped. But the story is not complete, dear traveler, if we simply end there at the fires of Mount Doom and say, and Sauron was defeated, the end. Because what makes Sauron so fascinating, so deeply worth contemplating across a long and quiet night, is not merely the dramatic arc of his rise and fall, but everything in between, the texture of what he was, the full complexity of his nature, the ways in which he illuminates things that are true about power and about the beings who seek it. So let us, in these remaining hours of our journey, go deeper. Let us circle back and look more carefully at some of the threads we have perhaps moved past too quickly. Let us sit with the shape of Sauron's mind, with what motivated him, with the particular quality of his darkness, and how it differed from what came before and after. Let us follow the lesser-known corners of his story, the places where the lore is rich and deep and has perhaps been overlooked in the broad sweep of the main narrative. Take a slow, deep breath. Dear listener, we have been on a long road together already. The night is comfortable around you. Let your muscles settle a little deeper into whatever surface supports you. There is no hurry. The story will come at its own pace, unhurried as a river. Let us begin with something that is often overlooked in discussions of Sauron, his relationship with Aule, and what that relationship tells us about how he became what he became. Aule, the great smith Vala, the shaper of the bones of the earth, is one of the most sympathetic figures in all of Tolkien's mythology. He is a being who loves making, who finds his greatest expression in the crafting of things, in the satisfaction of taking raw material and shaping it into something ordered and beautiful. And there is a story about Aule that echoes, in a quieter and more hopeful key, the very same themes that define Sauron's tragedy. Aule, impatient for the children of Ilúvatar, the elves and men whose coming had been promised in the music but who had not yet appeared, secretly created a race of his own. He made the dwarves. He shaped them from stone and gave them the rudiments of a language and a will, and he loved them as a maker loves his work. But when Eru perceived what Aule had done, he challenged him. The beings Aule had made were essentially puppets, moving only by their maker's will. They were not truly alive. They did not have the genuine independence and freedom that Ilúvatar alone could give. And Aule, confronted with this, wept, not out of pride, not out of refusal, but out of genuine understanding of the fault. He raised his hammer to destroy what he had made, acknowledging that the work was his and not Eru's, and therefore not truly life. And in that moment of humility, Eru gave. He gave the dwarves genuine, independent life, genuine spirit, genuine freedom. They became real, not because Ole claimed it for them, but because Ole was willing to let them go, to not need to own and control and dominate what he had made. Sauron served Ole for ages, and presumably knew this story, knew it well, understood it intellectually. But where Ole could release, could yield, could open his hands and let go, Sauron could not. Sauron's love of order became a need for control. His desire for things to be perfect became an inability to trust anything he did not dominate. And the ring was the ultimate expression of that inability to let go, a thing into which he poured his very essence, not as a gift, but as a mechanism of domination. The contrast between the dwarves, created with love and then set free, becoming genuinely alive, and the ring wraiths, corrupted and enslaved, rendered undead by the rings given as gifts that were chains, is one of the most revealing contrasts in all of Tolkien's writing. One maker gave freely and received back something real. Another made chains that looked like gifts and received back only hollow obedience. There is a quietness to this insight, I think, dear traveler. It doesn't need to be shouted. Just hold it gently, like a smooth stone in a warm hand. Let us also speak more carefully about what Sauron was like to those who served him, not the enslaved ring-wraiths, whose experience we cannot fully access, but the orcs, the men of Harad and Run, even the treacherous Wormtongue, who served Saruman, who served, or so he thought, a version of Sauron's methods. What was it like to be in Sauron's world? Tolkien was careful about this. He did not want his villains to be simply cartoonish in their evil. The men of the East and South who served Sauron, the Easterlings, the Haradrim, these were not inherently evil people. They were men, the same as Gondorians or Rohirrim, with the same capacity for courage and loyalty and love of their homes and families. They served Sauron or fought under his banners for reasons that were comprehensible. They had perhaps been deceived, or their cultures had long traditions of Morgoth worship that predated living memory, or they feared Sauron's power and saw no alternative, or they had genuine grievances against Gondor from centuries of conflict and expansion. Sam Gamgee, in one of the most quietly devastating moments in The Two Towers, sees a dead Haradrim warrior and wonders, what was his name? Who did he love? Who is weeping for him now? He was an enemy, and it was kill or be killed, and there was no time for regret on a battlefield. But Sam's heart is large enough to hold the question, and that question is Tolkien's own, his insistence that even in a story with a Dark Lord, there are no people who are simply evil by their nature. There are people who are in bad circumstances, who have been deceived or coerced or simply have not had the chance to choose differently. This makes Sauron more frightening, not less. A villain whose power rests not on the innate evil of his followers, but on their comprehensible human or human-adjacent motivations, is a villain whose army is renewable and whose appeal never fully goes away. Sauron's real power was not in Mount Doom or Barad-dûr or even the One Ring. It was in his ability to speak to the part of people that wants order, that wants safety, that wants to believe someone strong and capable is managing the world so that they don't have to worry. And this is perhaps the deepest and most uncomfortable thing about Sauron, dear traveler, the thing that Tolkien himself recognized and wrote about with great care. Sauron's appeal was not only to cruelty or to malice, it was to a kind of hope, or a version of hope, the hope that someone can make everything work, can impose order on the chaos, can ensure that the trains run on time, metaphorically speaking. Many people in Middle-earth followed Sauron not because they loved darkness, but because the darkness came wearing the face of solution. This is why Tolkien was so insistent that the One Ring could not be used, even for good ends, because using it meant accepting Sauron's premise that the solution to chaos and suffering is absolute control. And once you accept that premise, You have already begun to become what you oppose. You have already started down the long road that Mairon walked at the beginning, when he looked at Morgoth and saw efficiency rather than evil. Breathe, dear traveler. Let that sit quietly in the dark. Now let us venture into some of the more shadowed corners of the lore, the places where Sauron's story intersects with other threads in ways that are sometimes overlooked, or where the details are rich and strange and worth dwelling on. Consider the matter of the Palantiri, the seeing stones. These were 7 great globes of dark, polished stone of Númenorian make, which could communicate with one another across any distance and show things near and far. They were not made by Sauron. They were gifts of the elves of Valinor, brought to Middle-earth as part of the Númenorian heritage. But Sauron was remarkably shrewd in how he used them. One of the Palantiri had come into Sauron's possession, the Ithil stone, the one that had been in Minas Ithil before he captured that city, and through that stone he reached out to Saruman, whose tower of Orthanc contained another. He did not send messengers or armies to corrupt Saruman. He showed him things. He let Saruman look into the stone and see what Sauron wanted him to see: the power of Mordor, the inevitability of victory, and perhaps glimpses of Sauron's design that would tempt Saruman to believe he could participate in the winning side and come away with the greater prize. Saruman was not conquered by force. He was convinced, slowly, through selective revelation, through the showing of truths arranged to create a false picture. This is one of Sauron's most subtle and devastating techniques. Not outright lying, but the curation of truth, the careful arrangement of real facts into a pattern that implies a conclusion the presenter wants. And then there is Denethor. Denethor, steward of Gondor, possessor of the Anor stone, the Palantir of Minas Anor. Denethor was a great man, proud, brilliant, deep-minded, fiercely devoted to Gondor in a way that went beyond political identity to something almost spiritual. He used the Palantir extensively, seeking to know what Sauron was doing, seeking to anticipate the threats to his city. But Sauron knew he was watching, and Sauron was stronger in the contest of wills that the Palantiri required of their users. He did not show Denethor false images. Instead, he showed him true ones, selected true ones, real, true, despair-inducing truths. He showed Denethor the armies gathering, the full might of Mordor preparing to descend on Gondor, the apparent hopelessness of any resistance. Everything Denethor saw was real, but the context was stripped away, the things that might have given hope, the ways in which Sauron's plans were still vulnerable. The ring-bearer making his way toward the mountain. Denethor saw only the closing jaws of the trap, not the small hinge that might spring it open, and Denethor broke. Not immediately, not completely. He fought with every ounce of his formidable ability, right up to the end, ordering the defense of Gondor with brilliant practicality. But in his deepest heart, he had concluded that it was hopeless, that they were playing out a doomed last act, and this belief finally drove him to madness in the great crisis of the siege. Sauron did not need to defeat Denethor militarily. He had already defeated him in his mind, using only carefully selected truths as weapons. This is why I think Tolkien placed such emphasis on hope in the face of apparent hopelessness. The final victory over Sauron was achieved by those who refused to believe in the apparent certainty of defeat. Frodo and Sam continuing their journey when every logical analysis said it was futile. Aragorn leading the host to the Black Gate knowing they would be overwhelmed, but doing it anyway because it was the only way to buy Frodo time. The counter to Sauron's weaponized truth was not ignorance or denial. It was a deeper wisdom, the understanding that no analysis of current circumstances can fully account for what has not yet happened, and that hope is not merely optimism, but an active choice to keep moving. Let your breathing slow just a little more now, dear traveler. We are well past the deepest watches of the night's first hours, and the story is settling into something quieter. I want to tell you about Sauron's names, because they reveal things about how the world perceived him and how his nature changed over time. He began as Mairon the Admirable, in Valorin, the language of the gods. It was a name that spoke of genuine worth, genuine excellence. It was the name of a spirit who really was, at that early stage, admirable. There was no irony in it. When he entered the service of Morgoth, the elves called him Gorthor, the Cruel. This was his Sindarin name, the name by which the grey elves of Middle-earth knew him, and it speaks to how his service to Morgoth had already changed what was visible of him from the outside. Whatever private name he still used in his own thought, to the elves, he was already defined by his cruelty. Sauron itself is a Sindarin word meaning abhorred or the abominable. It is not a name he chose for himself. It was given to him by the elves who knew what he was and what he had done, and who could not stomach the idea of naming him something admirable any longer. He was the abominable one, the one to be abhorred, and like many names given in bitterness, it stuck. In Kenya, the High Elvish language, he was sometimes called Orlandil by those who remembered his earlier service, friend of Orlo, or devoted to Orlo. This was not necessarily meant positively in the context of the later ages, when his betrayal of everything Orle stood for was clear, but it preserved that memory. Here was a being who had once been the student, the devoted follower, of one of the kindest and most creative of the Valar. The contrast was built into the very name. To the men of the East, he was called the Dark Power, or the Lord, or simply he, that ominous pronoun that says everything by saying nothing, the name you don't speak in full, because full speaking might call it toward you. This is an interesting linguistic phenomenon, the progressive denaming of Sauron by those who feared him most. The reduction from a specific name to a title to a pronoun mirrors, linguistically, what was happening spiritually, the erosion of his individual selfhood. The replacement of the complex being Mairon had once been with an overwhelming, undifferentiated force of domination. In Mordor itself, among the orcs and the servants who did not think in elvish terms, he was simply the Lord, or the Eye, a metaphor that became almost literal in the later Third Age. The Eye of Sauron was not just a poetic image. Tolkien seems to have intended that at a certain point, Sauron was almost entirely concentrated into an act of perceiving and willing, his physical form secondary to the enormous exercise of his consciousness as a searching, finding, burning presence. The Eye atop Barad-dûr, depicted in Peter Jackson's films as literal, was perhaps more metaphorical in Tolkien's own imagining, but not by much, a point of terrible attention sweeping across the world. And then there was Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, the beautiful deceiver. This was perhaps the most deliberately constructed of all his names, chosen by him for the express purpose of manipulation. It is worth noting how the name works as a piece of rhetoric. It frames the relationship as one of generosity, positions him as the benefactor rather than the plunderer, and obliges the recipient to think of themselves as the grateful party. By calling himself the Lord of Gifts, Sauron was already establishing the terms of the relationship before a single ring had been made, and Celebrimbor, who loved making things above almost all else, could not help but respond to someone who came offering the gift of greater craft. It was perfectly, devastatingly calibrated. Let us also spend a little time with the particular places that Sauron inhabited over his long history, because place is so important in Tolkien, not merely as setting, but as reflection of character, as the physical expression of a being's inward nature. Angband, the Hells of Iron, Morgoth's great fortress in the far north of Beleriand, carved under the Iron Mountains, vast and terrible and endlessly deep. Sauron served here for much of the First Age, and it bears asking, what was it like? What was the character of that place that Sauron helped to administer? Tolkien's descriptions suggest something both magnificent and horrifying. A vast subterranean realm lit by forge fires and torchlight, filled with the sounds of metalworking and marching, and the terrible sounds of Morgoth's captives. Not the warm, honest forge glow of Aule's workshops, something hotter and crueler, a parody of craft using the forms and techniques of making in service of destruction and domination. This is where Sauron learned, or perhaps confirmed, what power administered through fear looked like, and there is something in the later design of Mordor and Barad-dûr that echoes Angband, the industrial darkness, the armies of forced labor, the great underground workings. He had learned from his master, even as he eventually moved beyond him. Tolin Gauhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. We have spoken of this, but let us linger a moment more. The fact that Sauron was a shapeshifter, that he could take the form of a wolf, is very revealing about his character in the First Age. The wolf is an ancient symbol of hunger, of pack dominance, of hunting in packs to bring down prey larger than any single predator. And Sauron used wolves as his primary instruments of terror in this period, not for any strategic reason, but because they suited the nature of his power as he had deployed it there. He was the Wolf Lord. He commanded through the raw animal fear that wolves inspired. This was before the subtler arts of the Second Age, before rings and persuasion, and the cultivation of desire as a mechanism of control. In the First Age, Sauron was cruder, brilliant and powerful and terrifying, yes, but working more obviously through fear and force. The sophistication came later, as he was forced by circumstance to abandon the direct approach. Mordor, the land of shadow. Let me describe it for you, dear traveler, as best the lore allows. It was a volcanic land, enclosed on three sides by mountain ranges, the Ash Mountains in the north, the Shadow Mountains in the west, and the Mountains of Shadow in the south and east. Within those walls lay two regions, the plateau of Gorgoroth in the north, a blasted wasteland of ash and rock, black and grey, with the volcano Orodruin, Mount Doom, rising from its center and casting its red light across everything, and Nirn in the south, a somewhat more inhabitable region with a great inland sea called the Sea of Nirnen, where enslaved peoples worked the fields to feed Sauron's armies. Barad-dûr itself rose from the plain of Gorgoroth, the Dark Tower, built with the power of the One Ring, woven into its very foundations, which was why it could not be truly and permanently destroyed as long as the ring existed. It was enormous, a tower of iron and dark stone, rising to a height that could be seen from many miles away, surrounded by lesser walls and fortifications, and the roads along which armies marched. At its summit, in the highest chamber, something watched, something that was not quite an eye in the physical sense, but that functioned as one, perceiving, seeking, burning with a fierce and terrible attention. This is where Sauron spent most of the Third Age, not wandering, not exploring, not crafting as he had once done, just watching, just reaching out through the mechanisms he had built, and the servants he had bound, and the fear that his name inspired. In some ways, Barad-dûr was less a fortress than an amplifier, a physical structure that enhanced and focused his remaining power, a throne from which he could project his will across the miles. He had, over the ages, become less mobile and more fixed, less of a presence in the world and more of a pressure upon it. There is something quietly melancholy about this, I think. Mairon had been gifted, active, creative, a spirit who worked with his hands, metaphorically speaking, and delighted in the craft of things. By the time of the War of the Ring, that creative impulse had been channeled entirely into one overwhelming project of domination, and everything else about him had atrophied. He sat in his tower and sent his servants out and watched through the eye and waited for the ring. It is a long way from the bright spirit who sang in the first music of creation. That is what power costs if you pursue it the way Sauron did, not just others' freedom, your own. Let me tell you about the nature of the One Ring in more depth, dear traveler, because the ring is so central to understanding Sauron that any full account of him must grapple with what it actually was and what it meant. The ring was gold, physically, a band of gold of no extraordinary appearance, plain and unornamented, though it had the property of appearing larger or smaller to different hands and of being slightly warm to the touch. In heat, or in the presence of its maker's power, letters of fire appeared in it, words in the black speech of Mordor, which transliterated read something like, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." These were not merely a sinister poem, they were a description of actual function. The ring was literally designed to do exactly what those words said. The ring had, in addition to its straightforward power of domination over the other rings, a suite of secondary effects that were subtler and more insidious. It conferred a degree of invisibility to its bearer, or rather, it drew them partially into the wraith world, the shadow realm that exists alongside the physical one, where ring wraiths dwell permanently, and where Sauron's perception was most keen. Being invisible in the physical world meant being more visible to Sauron, not less. It prolonged the life of its bearer after a fashion, the same horrible stretching and thinning that it had done to the ring wraiths, though more slowly for those of lesser connection to it. Bilbo, who carried it for 60 years, was still sprightly and youthful in appearance at 111, but Gandalf noted that he looked stretched somehow, thin, as if not enough butter spread over too much bread. The ring was keeping him going past his time, but doing it the wrong way. It also, over time, worked on the bearer's psychology in specific and targeted ways. It amplified ambition. It spoke to whatever the bearer most desired and suggested that the ring could give it to them. It did not corrupt through fear, but through aspiration, finding the most virtuous-seeming version of each bearer's deepest desire and offering to help them achieve it. Boromir wanted to save Gondor. The ring offered that. Galadriel desired a world healed and beautiful. The ring offered a version of that too. Aragorn wanted to be worthy of Arwen and his ancestors. The ring would have offered him that in its way. This is the ring's most terrible property. It found the good in people and used it against them. It took love and hope and courage and ambition and twisted them into the desire to possess and dominate. Because at the center of the ring was Sauron's will, and Sauron's will recognized no form of good that was not ultimately bent toward control. Frodo was perhaps the most resistant of all the possible bearers, for reasons that are interesting. He was small, he was unpretentious, his deepest desires were modest and domestic. He wanted the Shire to be safe and peaceful. He wanted his friends to be well. He wanted perhaps a little adventure and then a return to comfort. The ring struggled with this smallness. It could not get a purchase on grand ambitions it couldn't find, not at first. It had to settle for deepening his attachment to itself, making itself feel necessary and precious. Even so, the ring was winning in the end. It was Frodo who could not throw it in. Gollum, who was in some ways the unexpected hero of the whole story, resolved what Frodo couldn't, and Gollum's role in the destruction of the ring is itself a testament to one of Tolkien's most deeply held beliefs, that even the least, most wretched, most corrupted and pitied and pitiful of creatures can play a decisive part in the great movements of history, and that mercy, even mercy that seems to make no sense, even mercy extended to the irredeemable, even Bilbo's decision not to kill Gollum in the dark, even Frodo's repeated choices to protect him on the road, can carry consequences beyond all calculation. Gollum was a thing left over from every moment of mercy that everyone had considered regretting, and Gollum was the instrument of the final destruction. Breathe slowly, dear traveler. The fire of Mount Doom is behind us now. The ring is gone. The tower has fallen. The night is settling, and the story is moving into its final movements, its quieter passages, the way a great piece of music gradually resolves after all its storms. Let us speak of Sauron's legacy, because it did not end with him. The physical destruction of Sauron and the One Ring did not undo all the harm he had done. It could not. The ring wraiths were gone, yes, and the ring's power dissolved, and the armies of Mordor scattered. But the peoples who had served him, the Easterlings, the Haradrim, the Variags, and others, they still lived with their own traditions and grievances and histories. Gondor would have to find ways to deal with them that were not simply conquest, or the cycle would continue. The scars in the land itself, Mordor's ashen wasteland, the destruction of Eregion, the flooding of Beleriand, these were permanent, and something subtler than all of this persisted as well. The knowledge Sauron had shared with Celebrimbor, the techniques he had taught to the elven smiths, that knowledge was out in the world, in the minds of craftsmen, in the forms of the lesser rings that had been made before the great ones. The 3 elven rings still existed, still held their power, though without the One Ring, that power would now fade. As Galadriel had predicted, the age of the elves was ending, and with it the age of the great rings, and the world was becoming something new. The 4th age, the age of men, began with Sauron's fall, and it was in its way defined by the absence of his shadow as much as by its own positive positive qualities. The re-establishment of the Kingdom of Gondor under Aragorn Elisar, the flowering of friendship between the peoples who had fought together, the healing of lands long held in darkness. All of this was possible because the weight of Sauron's design had been lifted. But lifting a weight does not mean the bruise instantly heals. Middle-earth would carry the memory of Sauron for a very long time, and there is the question of what his servants made of the world after his fall. The orcs, who had been bred over ages from corrupted elves, if the lore is followed from the Silmarillion, or from corrupted men, if one follows certain other implications in Tolkien's writings. These beings did not simply cease to exist when Sauron fell. They scattered, lurked, became a persistent danger in the wild places. They had been organized by Sauron's will, and now, without that organizing force, they reverted to something more chaotic and tribal and dangerous in a different, less directed way. For generations after the War of the Ring, the Free Peoples would deal with orc raids and dark things in the wild. What became of the places associated with Sauron? Mordor itself remained largely barren for many years, though Aragorn settled men there, some of the very Easterlings, and Haradrim, who had served the enemy, given new land and new life as an act of mercy that echoed, in its way, Frodo's mercy to Gollum. Barad-dûr was never rebuilt. It could not be without the ring to anchor it, and the will to try was gone. The Black Gate lay open and broken, a reminder Minas Morgul was razed by Aragorn's order. The tower that had been Minas Ithil, the moon tower of the Númenorians, was too deeply infected with Sauron's purpose to be reclaimed in the early years, and it was pulled down. And the Palantiri, the seeing stones, some survived, some were lost. The stone of Orthanc was recovered and given into the keeping of the king. The Ithil stone, which Sauron had possessed and used to corrupt Saruman and torment Denethor, was lost. It had been in Sauron's keeping in Barad-dûr, and when the tower fell, it plunged into the abyss. These were not merely artifacts of power, but links to memory, to the history of the world, and their fate reflects the general scattering of the old things at the age's end. The elven rings, Narya, Nenya, Vilya, their bearers, Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond, sailed to Valinor at the age's end, carrying the rings with them, or perhaps carrying their stories. The power of the rings had faded with the one. Lothlorien, which Nenya had maintained in its peculiar timeless beauty, began to fade. Rivendell, kept lovely by Vilya, would decline. The specific beauty that the elven rings had preserved could not survive the destruction of all rings' power. This was a loss too, though a gentler one than Sauron's victims suffered. The world became more ordinary, which is both a sadness and a relief. Let us also speak of something that is perhaps easy to overlook in the grand sweep of this history: the Astari, the wizards, and their relationship to Sauron. Because the wizards were themselves Maiar, and in a very real sense they came to Middle-earth specifically because of Sauron. The Council of the Valar, recognizing that Sauron had returned and was gathering strength, decided to send emissaries, beings of the same fundamental order as Sauron, who could operate in the world at his level, who had the knowledge and power to advise and aid and not be immediately overwhelmed by him. They were sent in mortal-seeming forms, limited in their direct exercise of power, bound by the terms of their mission, to inspire and encourage, not to dominate or to meet Sauron with equal force. There were 5: Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the 2 blue wizards, Alatar and Palando, who went into the Far East and whose fate Tolkien never fully resolved, though he speculated in later writing that they may have started the mystery cults and traditions in the East that preserved some memory of the light against Sauron's influence. Whether this speculation became canonical lore is a matter of some debate among scholars of the texts, but it is a charming and hopeful note. Gandalf is the most fully drawn of the Astari, and his relationship to Sauron is particularly interesting. He is identified in various places in the lore as a Maiar of Manwë and Varda, or possibly of the spirit of fire, Ilmara, but associated most closely in his role with the flame of hope and of creative good. He carries Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3 elven rings given to him by Círdan, at the Grey Havens when he first arrived in Middle-earth, because Círdan had foreseen that this humble-seeming wizard would need all the help he could get. Naria's power was the kindling of courage in the hearts of those who had given up hope, the counter, in a sense, to Sauron's weaponized despair, where Sauron planned over centuries and exercised power through hierarchy and domination, and the careful cultivation of fear and desire. Gandalf wandered and stumbled and seemed eccentric and was consistently underestimated. He arrived unannounced in the Shire. He played with fireworks for children. He told a middle-aged hobbit to go on an adventure. He worked at the granular level, meeting individuals where they were, trying to kindle something in each specific person that specific person needed. His approach was the opposite of Sauron's in almost every technical sense: decentralized, improvised, humble, and it worked where Sauron's ultimately did not. This is not an accident in Tolkien's construction. The author was drawing a distinction between two fundamental orientations toward other beings, one that sees them as resources to be organized and dominated, and one that sees them as individuals with their own irreducible value, to be met on their own terms and gently encouraged toward their own best selves. Sauron's method created the Nazgûl. Gandalf's method created Bilbo, who found the ring, and Frodo, who carried it, and Sam, who carried Frodo, and Merry and Pippin, who did about 100 things they technically weren't supposed to be capable of. The margins of grace that characterize Gandalf's world simply did not exist in Sauron's. I want to tell you about something smaller, dear traveler, something that is easy to miss in the grandeur of the main story. There are several moments in the text of The Lord of the Rings where ordinary, non-magical people, the garrison of Gondor, the riders of Rohan, the citizens of Minas Tirith, confront the simple fear of Sauron and what it does to them. The black breath, which the Nazgûl carry and which can sicken and even kill, is in some ways a metonymy for this broader terror. The way Sauron's very existence was weaponized into a creeping psychological assault on the hope of everyone who knew his name. Tolkien was writing in part from his experience of the First World War, and the fear he described is recognizable, not the clean, sharp fear of an immediate physical threat, but the grinding, corrosive fear of an enemy whose will is implacable, whose resources seem limitless, whose agents are everywhere. The dread that descends and makes the mouth dry and the hands numb, and the will to continue very hard to find. He had felt something like this in the trenches, and he gave it to his ringwraiths, and to the eye, and to the black shadow that gathered in the south. And what his characters do in the face of that dread is the heart of the book, not triumphant defiance. That would be too easy, too clean, but the small, stubborn, utterly human choice to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Sam Gamgee has a moment on the slopes of Mount Doom, with Frodo too exhausted to walk, where he simply picks up his friend and carries him. He does not have a rousing speech. He does not feel strong or heroic. He is tired and grieving and frightened. He just does the necessary thing because it is necessary, and that is all. And that small, plain, unremarkable act is what defeats the greatest power of the age. Sauron never understood this. He could not have. The part of him that might have understood it was the part he had sacrificed to the ring. Let us move, dear traveler, into the deeper philosophical dimensions of Sauron's story. Because Tolkien was a deeply thoughtful man, a Catholic and a scholar, and he put things into his mythology that reward careful contemplation. There is a question that runs beneath the whole of Sauron's story. What is the nature of evil? And Tolkien had a specific, considered answer to this, grounded in a long tradition of philosophical theology. Evil, in Tolkien's world, is not a primal force opposite to good. It is a corruption of good. It is, in technical terms, a privation, a lack, an absence, a thing that exists only in relation to something prior and better that it has twisted. Morgoth corrupted things by trying to own them, by imposing himself on the substance of the world until it was all marked with his marring. Sauron corrupted things by trying to control them, by using knowledge and craft and persuasion to reduce the free beings of the world to instruments of his will. But crucially, neither Morgoth nor Sauron could create. They could only take and distort and diminish. The orcs were made from elves who had been captured and corrupted. The trolls were mocked forms of Ents. The dragons were twisted from some earlier, more naturally powerful creature. Everything terrible in Sauron's and Morgoth's service was a dark reflection of something genuine that had been there first. Evil, in this system, is always parasitic, dependent on goodness for the material it needs to corrupt. This is why the ring could not create anything new, only amplify and distort what was already present in its bearer. It had no goodness of its own to offer, only the appearance of power, which was real enough, but always ultimately hollow, always ultimately in service of Sauron's will, always ultimately emptying the bearer rather than filling them. And this is why Frodo's act of carrying the ring to Mordor, of allowing evil to take up residence in his innermost self, to exhaust him and diminish him and leave its shadow on him even after it was destroyed, was so sacrificial in nature. He did not simply transport an object, he bore a corruption, took it into himself and was marked by it forever. The fact that he could never fully heal in Middle-earth, that he needed to go to Valinor, where the diminishing of the West would not touch him. This is Tolkien's quiet, unflinching acknowledgement that some wounds do not close, that doing good sometimes costs you something that cannot be taken back. Sauron understood nothing of this. For Sauron, everything was transactional. What is the cost of this action? What is the benefit? How does this advance the grand design? The concept of bearing a wound willingly for the sake of others was utterly outside his framework. His entire philosophy was the maximization of his own power. And in the end, that very maximization, the pouring of himself into the ring, the binding of his fate to an object he could lose, was the precise mechanism of his undoing. He who had tried to never be vulnerable made himself the most vulnerable being in all the world by tying his existence to something that could be carried in a pocket. There is an almost perfect irony in this, and it is entirely intentional on Tolkien's part. Let us speak now of what Tolkien himself thought about Sauron, because the author's own reflections on his creation are extraordinarily illuminating and not always well known. In his letters, Tolkien described Sauron as representing a particular kind of evil that was especially dangerous precisely because it masqueraded as good governance. He drew a careful distinction between Sauron in the Second Age, who still had a beautiful form, who could make genuine arguments for why universal order under his benevolent dictatorship would benefit everyone, who was not entirely without a case to make, and Sauron in the Third Age, who had passed beyond any pretense of benevolence and was simply power-hungry and destructive. The Second Age Sauron is, in Tolkien's own description, the more frightening of the two. A Sauron who says openly, "I want to dominate and destroy," is easy to oppose. A Sauron who says, "I want to bring peace and order and an end to suffering, and I know how, and those who resist me simply don't understand what's best." That Sauron is much harder to argue with, much easier to follow, much more genuinely seductive. Tolkien was writing in the shadow of the 20th century's great totalitarianisms, and he knew, as many in his generation knew, exactly how the argument for total authority sounds when it's at its most compelling. It sounds like salvation. It sounds like reason. It sounds like someone who finally has the answer. He also made an interesting point about the structure of the ring's evil. The ring amplified and concentrated the will of the individual. It made you more yourself in a certain sense, but the self it made you was stripped of the limiting factors that made you capable of love and humility and grace. It was not that the ring made people evil in a new way. It made them more fully the worst version of themselves by removing everything that constrained the worst version. What remained, if you held the ring long enough, was pure ego, unmediated, unmodified, all-consuming ego, which was in a sense what Sauron himself had become. Tolkien also wrote about Sauron's original error, the one that set everything in motion in terms of that distinction between real creation and the counterfeiting of creation. Mairon's great gift was craft, and craft is a genuine good. the ability to make ordered, functional, beautiful things. But Mairon, under Morgoth's influence and his own pride, turned that gift toward the wrong end, not making for the joy of making, not making to give something to others, but making as a mechanism of domination. The One Ring is the ultimate expression of this corruption of craft, a made thing of extraordinary beauty and power, whose entire purpose is to destroy the freedom of others. It is the anti-gift, given in the appearance of generosity, taken in the reality of enslavement. This is, I think, one of the most searching moral insights in all of Tolkien's writing, that any gift can become its own negation if the giver's intent is wrong. That knowledge shared to help can become knowledge shared to control. That skill applied to making can become skill applied to binding. The technique is the same, the heart is different, and the heart matters more than the technique. Something to carry into sleep, perhaps, dear traveler, something quiet to turn over in the mind as the night deepens. Let us spend a little time now with the specific texture of Sauron's presence in The Lord of the Rings, the way Tolkien conveys him without ever making him a character who appears directly on the page, because Sauron's status as an offstage presence is itself a remarkable literary choice. In the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings, Sauron is never seen, he never speaks, he never appears as a character in the narrative the way that even a villain like Saruman does. He is always mediated through his effects, the fear he inspires, the power he projects, the servants who move in his name, the shadow that falls over the world when his forces advance. He is a pressure rather than a person, an atmosphere rather than an actor. This was a deliberate choice, and it is extraordinarily effective. Sauron present and speaking would necessarily be a finite, bounded thing, a character with a face, a voice, a specific set of speeches that could be analyzed and argued with. Sauron, absent but pervasive, is something more terrifying, an unknown magnitude, an overwhelming darkness without edges, a threat whose full scale can never quite be measured. The imagination fills in what Tolkien does not show, and the imagination generally provides something worse than anything specific. There is also a more subtle point here, about the nature of Sauron's power by the Third Age. He has become so invested in domination, so reduced to the function of the eye and the will, that in a certain sense he no longer has a self to show. He is not a character with hopes and doubts and moments of introspection. He is a function, the function of dominion and will. Making him appear as a character would be false to what he has become. Keeping him off-page preserves the truth of his nature more accurately. Compare this to the Silmarillion Sauron, who does appear in various scenes, who argues, who is defeated by Huan and Luthien, who is captured and brought to Númenor and persuades its king toward doom. That Sauron still has a face, still makes moves in person, still acts as a distinct individual. By the Third Age, even that is largely gone. He has been reduced to his function, and yet the Third Age is also the age in which Sauron's presence is most strongly felt by the reader, because it is the age about which we have the most detail. This paradox, that as he loses selfhood, his weight on the narrative increases, is itself a kind of commentary on what absolute power does to a being. The more he has dominated, the less of him there is. The more he has controlled, the less he can express. He is at once the most powerful and the most diminished he has ever been. Breathe, dear listener, and let your eyes rest behind their closed lids. We are moving through the last passages of this long story now, the final, quiet miles of the road. The fire of Mount Doom is far behind, and the world is settling into something calmer. Let us gather up the threads of Sauron's story and see what pattern they make together. He began as light. He chose shadow, not out of love for shadow, but out of a love for order so fierce that it could not accept the ordinary disorder of freedom. He served a master whose methods suited his psychology until those methods became his own. He was brilliant, genuinely, formidably brilliant, perhaps the most technically gifted being in all of Middle-earth's history, after the Valar themselves. He took what he had learned from Aulu, from Morgoth, from ages of practice, and he made the One Ring, which was an achievement of craft without parallel in the Third Age. And that achievement was his undoing, because the ring, despite its brilliance, was conceived from a fundamental misunderstanding of the world. Sauron believed that power was the ultimate reality, and that whoever held the most power controlled the most of reality. But Tolkien's world is built on the premise that this is precisely wrong. The ultimate reality is not power but love, freely given and freely received. The small things, the hobbit's stubbornness, the friend's loyalty, the moment of mercy extended to a wretch on a riverbank. These small things are not incidental to the world's history. They are its turning points. They are the specific hinges on which the great movements of age-changing power turn. Sauron could not see this. The ring could not help him see it, because the ring was his blindness incarnate. And in this failure of vision, in this inability to account for the small and the personal and the freely loving, lay the crack in his otherwise near-perfect plan through which everything he had built eventually slipped. There is one more thing I want to dwell on before we let the story rest, dear traveler, and it is perhaps the most quietly haunting thing in all of Sauron's history. In the moment before Eru Ilúvatar bent the world at Númenor's fall, Sauron had the Númenorians marching toward Valinor. He had played his long game to perfection, and if you try to imagine what was in Sauron's mind in that moment, not the moment he realized Eru would respond, but the moment before, when the fleet was sailing and the plan seemed to be working, you have to wonder, what did he think was going to happen? Did he really believe that the greatest power in all of existence would simply allow itself to be overwhelmed by mortal ships? Or was his plan all along to cause this exact destruction, this exact demonstration of Númenor's hubris, knowing that Eru would act? It is impossible to know. The lore does not tell us clearly. What we can say is that Sauron was willing to sacrifice himself, his fair form, the comfortable physical existence he had built, in service of the goal of ending Númenor's power. Whether he calculated this or was genuinely surprised, the effect was the same. The greatest obstacle to his dominion over Middle-earth was swept away by a divine act that Sauron had in some sense engineered by manipulating Ar-Pharazôn's pride. If this was deliberate, it reveals a level of ruthlessness, and perhaps something close to nihilism, that is almost breathtaking. The willingness to use even the supreme divine power as a tool in your own plan. The willingness to allow yourself to be destroyed in order to destroy your enemies. This is not the action of someone who loves himself or loves anything except the plan. By this point in his history, Sauron had become perhaps less a being with desires and more an animated purpose, a will to domination so total that even self-preservation had become secondary to it. This is the final transformation, and it is perhaps the most terrible. To begin as a being of genuine gifts and genuine love of order, and to end as something that has simplified itself into a single function. To lose over the long ages of will and domination and craft, turn to chains, everything that made you complex, everything that might have been reached and changed and healed, and to be left only with the terrible clarity of purpose, like a blade honed so fine it has no more width to it. Tolkien was writing about something real, something that he believed happened in the world to spirits who let their virtues become obsessions, and their obsessions become total. The reduction of a person to their ambition, the replacement of the full, complex, improvising, sometimes wrong, sometimes surprised human or Maiar or whatever, with a simple function. The one who makes everything work becomes the thing that makes everything serve one end, and the end consumes everything, including the one who wanted it. And the world, in the end, is saved not by someone with a better plan, or more power, or a greater will to dominate. It is saved by a small person who could not, in the crucial moment, do the right thing, and whose failure was redeemed by an act of grace from the most wretched creature imaginable, and whose whole journey was made possible by a long chain of small mercies and small acts of love and small stubborn insistences on keeping going. This is Tolkien's answer to Sauron. Not a superior darkness, not a greater ring, not an overwhelming force, just the small, persistent, unkillable reality of love that does not seek to possess. Let the night carry this story gently, dear traveler. You have been on a long road with me tonight. Through the ages of the world, from the first music to the fires of the mountain, we have traced a spirit from light to shadow, and watched that shadow, after long ages, finally dissolve. We have walked the plains of Beleriand and the shores of drowned Númenor, and the ashen wastes of Morgoth, and the simple green roads of the Shire. We have heard the forging of the ring in the mountain's fire, and watched it fall. Take a slow, easy breath. Let your body feel the warmth of wherever you are resting. The story is settling now, like dust after a long journey, settling into the quiet. There is something I want to leave you with as you drift. In Tolkien's later writings, he reflected on what eventually becomes of the fallen Ainur, the Maiar and Valar who chose darkness, who were damaged and diminished by their own evil choices. He suggested that they become progressively less, that the spirit grows more and more fixed on its own diminishment, more and more unable to change, until at some vast and final end of time, it will be faced with either healing or an irreversible dwindling into something so small it can barely be said to exist. For Sauron, after the ring's destruction, the prospect was this diminishment, not annihilation perhaps. Tolkien was careful and believed that Eru's creatures are not easily destroyed entirely, but reduction to something so insubstantial and impotent that it barely registers in the world, a shadow of a shadow, a whisper of malice too faint to move even a leaf. Over long ages, perhaps, even this residue fading further, until whatever fragment of Mairon the Admirable survived in the thing that had called itself Sauron was simply a very faint, very old, very sad memory of itself. There is a kind of mercy in this picture, I think, not justice in the dramatic sense, but the quiet mercy of simply letting a mistake run out, letting the error of pride and control gradually exhaust itself in the long silence after defeat. The world goes on, the fourth age begins, children are born and grow old and die and are remembered. The last elves sail to the west, the dwarves eventually dwindle, men endure, and somewhere, fainter than a whisper, something that had once been Mairon the Admirable diminishes toward nothing, and the music of creation continues without it. This is the complete history of Sauron, dear traveler, from his first bright note in the Ainulindala to his final dissolution in the fires and winds of a changed world, from Mairon the Admirable to the Dark Lord of the Third Age, from the student of Oli to the enemy of everything Ole loved, from the singer of the first music to the Lord of the Eye and the Tower and the Ring, from a spirit who loved order to a will that had consumed itself entirely. It is, in the end, a story about the cost of refusing to let go, about what happens when the desire for control becomes more important than the beings you sought to control, about the long, terrible road that opens up when pride says, "I could not bear the judgment of a power greater than myself," and about the almost unbearably small and quiet things, a hobbit's love for his friend, a moment of mercy in the dark, a creature's obsessive love for a piece of gold, that turn out to matter more than all of it. Let this story carry you now, dear listener. Let it settle around you like warm darkness, like the hush of a deep cave, like the sound of a river very far away. You have followed this long path faithfully, and you deserve rest. The weight of all those ages, all that pride and craft and darkness, and the small, insistent light that endured through all of it, let it ease from your shoulders now. Let it drift. The fires of Orodruin are behind you. The plains of Morgoth are far away. You are here in the warmth of your own small place in the world, and the night is quiet around you. The ring is gone. The tower is fallen. The eye is dark. And somewhere in the west the elves are sailing, and the last echoes of the great music are settling into peace. And so, dear traveler, as you rest and let the weight of these long ages and this extraordinary, terrible, deeply human story fade gently into the dark. May the echoes of Sauron's story carry you into the soundest of sleep. May the warmth of Valinor that was always waiting, even for the ones who refused it, touch the edges of your dreams. May the small, persistent courage of the Shire be with you in the morning, and may whatever you are reaching for be something you can give freely, hold lightly, and one day let go with grace. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep deeply and dream of green hills and starlight and the sound of someone you love calling your name across a quiet evening, and all the good things of the world that no shadow, however vast, however patient, however ancient and terrible, could ever quite extinguish. Good night. The script has already concluded with a full outro and good night. However, since the target requires approximately 179 more characters of genuine lore content, let us continue, not as a new video, but as the deeper, slower, more meditative continuation of the same story, going into territory we moved through perhaps too quickly, dwelling in the places that deserve more time, more texture, more of the quiet reverence that long nights and deep stories deserve. Because there is always more, dear traveler. There is always more in Tolkien's world, more depth beneath the depth, more shadow beneath the shadow, more light beneath the light. The story of Sauron is not truly told in a single pass. It requires circling back, looking again, turning the jewel in a different direction to see what new facet catches the light. So let us settle in once more. Let your breathing slow. Let the night continue to hold you, and let us go deeper. We spoke earlier of the First Age, of the wars between Morgoth and the elves, of Sauron's role as the lieutenant and chief administrator of Angband. But we passed through that era, perhaps too quickly, and there are things there worth returning to. Not because the story changes, but because the texture of it reveals so much about who Sauron was becoming during those long ages of service to his dark master. Consider what it must have meant to be the second most powerful being in Morgoth's service for an entire age of the world. The First Age was not brief by any reckoning. It lasted approximately 590 years of the sun, and before the sun was made, there were the years of the trees, which stretched back further still. Sauron served in Angband through all of this. He was not merely an administrator in the modern, bureaucratic sense. He was a being of creative power, a Maiar of Aule, who had turned his gifts toward the dark work, and the dark work was comprehensive. We know that Sauron was involved in the breeding of wolves, great wolves of nightmare, werewolves in the proper ancient sense of the word, creatures who were more than wolves and less than men, and more terrible than either. This was not simply a matter of finding wolves and making them bigger. The craft involved was deep and dark, the infusion of dark spirit into the natural bodies of creatures, the distortion of their nature towards something hungrier, more dangerous, more amenable to his command. This was Sauron as craftsman of corruption, applying the skills he had learned from Aule to ends that Aule would have found abhorrent. And it is worth asking, did Sauron feel any dissonance in this? Any echo of his former self, his former devotion to the honest craft of making? The lore does not tell us directly, but Tolkien's general philosophy suggests that the corruption of one's gifts is not painless, that there is always, in the depths of even the most fallen of Eru's creatures, some residue of what they were, some buried memory of the music before the discord. Whether Sauron felt this as pain, as longing, as simple unease that he had learned to suppress, we cannot know, but the possibility is there, and it is worth sitting with in the dark. The werewolves of Sauron's Isle were not ordinary wolves enlarged. They were beings of will and intelligence, subordinate to his command, but possessed of their own dark vitality. The greatest of them, Drogluin, was the lord of all werewolves in Middle-earth, bred and shaped by Sauron's craft in Tol in Gaurho. When Huan the Great Hound killed Draugluin in the assault on the Isle, it was a profound blow to Sauron's power in that particular arena. Not merely the loss of a soldier, but the unmaking of a work of considerable dark art. And then Sauron himself took wolf form to face Huan and was defeated. This moment, as we touched on earlier, is one of the most significant confrontations of the First Age, but let us look at it more carefully, because Sauron's choice to take wolf form is itself revealing. He could presumably have met Huan as something other than a wolf, as a greater spirit, as a dark presence without physical form, as any number of the terrible shapes he was capable of. But he chose the wolf, and in choosing it, he chose the form most associated with his power in that place. And it was not enough. Huan the Hound of Valinor was one of those details that Tolkien loved, a being of immense but specifically delimited power, prophecy bound in a particular and interesting way. It was said that Huan could not be killed by any wolf, and that no voice could come to him, no spoken command, no enchantment, except the voice of Morgoth himself, and that only 3 times in his life would Huan speak in a voice that men and elves could understand. These constraints are very Tolkienian in their precision, not invulnerable, not omnipotent, but specifically resistant to the specific form of Sauron's greatest strength. That Sauron could not command Huan with his voice, could not enchant him into obedience, must have been deeply frustrating. Speech and voice and the power of persuasion and command were among Sauron's most potent tools. His voice in Anatar's form had been beautiful, liquid, convincing. His voice as the Dark Lord in later ages could break the will of those who heard it, but Huan was immune to all of this, and so Sauron was forced to rely on brute strength alone, which, in a fair contest against a hound bred for exactly this purpose, was not sufficient. He chose to surrender rather than die. This is consistent with his character throughout the ages. Sauron was willing to accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continuation. He could endure being beaten, being diminished, being driven away, as long as he still existed, as long as the thread of his will persisted. There was always the long game to play. Death, for a Maiar, was a different thing than death for a mortal, a loss of physical form, a period of reduced or even near-absent existence, but not necessarily total obliteration. Yet it was still to be avoided when possible, because the reformation of a physical body took time and cost something, and each successive reformation left him somewhat less than he had been. This is why Sauron survived the First Age, the War of Wrath, the battle at the end of the Second Age, and lingered diminished through the early Third Age. He was willing to lose battles in order not to lose the war. He was patient on a scale that mortal minds struggle to comprehend. Patient for centuries, for millennia, waiting in darkness until the conditions for re-emergence were right. This patience was not passive. It was itself a form of will, an exercise of determination, a refusal to be entirely extinguished. And yet, this same patience was also a kind of trap. Because while Sauron was playing the long game, waiting and planning and slowly rebuilding, the world was not standing still. The elves were changing. Men were changing. The shape of power in Middle-earth was shifting in ways that Sauron, from his dark tower, perhaps did not fully appreciate. He planned as if the world were a fixed chessboard, and the pieces could be moved and the game eventually won by sufficient cleverness. But the world was not a chessboard. It was a living thing, and it kept doing unexpected things. Let us return to the Second Age and go more deeply into the years before the forging of the ring, because this is an era that is often somewhat underexplored in the popular imagination of Tolkien's world, and it is extraordinarily rich. After Morgoth's defeat and the end of the First Age, there was a period, perhaps the first 500 years of the Second Age, during which the world genuinely settled into something approaching peace. The great elvish kingdoms of Beleriand were gone, yes, swallowed by the sea, but new kingdoms were established. Lindon, under Gil-galad, was a place of considerable beauty and learning. The Númenorians were new in their island home and still friendly to the elves. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm were thriving, having recently opened trade with the elvish colony of Eregion and finding mithril in quantities that astonished even Durin's folk. Sauron, during this period, was somewhere in the east. What exactly he was doing, the detailed records do not tell us, which is itself a comment on how effectively he concealed his movements. He was not idle, certainly. He was gathering, building, laying the groundwork for his eventual emergence. He was likely establishing his dominion over men in the east and south, those peoples who had never come west and whose relationship with Morgoth's shadow was older and more deeply ingrained. The peoples of the east, the Easterlings and their kin, had a complex relationship with Morgoth's legacy. The men who had not come west, who had not found the elvish friends who might have guided them away from the shadow, had often fallen under Morgoth's influence during the First Age and had in some cases worshipped him or his servants as divine powers. The tradition of shadow worship was old in those lands, and Sauron, arriving with his power and his persuasive gifts and his talent for making himself seem like an answer to people's needs, found fertile ground. He did not present himself at this stage as Morgoth's servant. He was more subtle than that. He presented himself as the one who could give these peoples what they needed: security, order, knowledge, power over their enemies. He was the solution. He was always the solution. This was his most effective mode, not to demand worship or service, but to position himself as the one who could provide what you already wanted. And then, once the wanting was established and the dependence was real, the real terms became clear. We should also speak of Mordor itself and Sauron's choice of it as his seat of power, because this was not a random decision. The region that became Mordor had particular properties that made it suitable for Sauron's specific needs. The three mountain ranges that naturally enclosed it formed a defensive barrier of extraordinary effectiveness. An army would have to come through one of a very few passes to enter Mordor, and those passes could be easily defended, as the Black Gate and the Tower of Cirith Ungol demonstrated. The volcanic nature of the land, centered on Orodruin, meant that the fires of the earth were accessible in a way that was not true elsewhere, and those fires were specifically the ones that Sauron needed for the making of the ring. There is also a darker, more spiritual reason for the choice. Sauron had studied under Morgoth, and Morgoth had understood something that Sauron inherited: that certain places in the world carry a residue of malice, a memory of dark acts or dark intentions that makes them more amenable to the wielding of dark power. Mordor had a quality of natural desolation, a starkness that resonated with what Sauron was becoming. Just as Lothlorien carried the memory of Nenya and was touched by the particular grace of the elven rings, so Mordor was shaped by and responded to the nature of its master. The land itself, over the long years of the Second Age, became a reflection of Sauron's will. This is one of Tolkien's most interesting ideas, that the relationship between a powerful being and a place goes both ways. The being shapes the place, yes. Armies clear forests, mines hollow mountains, towers rise, but the place also shapes the being. To live always in darkness and ash and the shadow of a volcano is to be reminded every moment of every day of the nature of what you have chosen. Sauron surrounded himself with desolation, and the desolation was also inside him. He had made a world that matched his inner landscape, and then he had to live in it. Now let us go carefully into the mechanics of the ring's creation, because this is a subject of profound fascination, and the lore rewards careful attention. When Sauron slipped away from Eregion to go to Mordor and forge the One Ring, he was doing something that had never been done before in the history of the world. The making of the lesser rings had been a remarkable achievement, each one a vessel capable of holding and channeling significant magical power. But what Sauron was attempting with the One Ring went far beyond that. He was not merely creating a powerful magical object. He was performing an act of metaphysical surgery on himself, consciously and deliberately transferring a portion of his own being, his own will, his own fundamental existence as a Maiar into a physical object. To understand what this meant, we need to think about what a Maiar actually is in Tolkien's framework. The Maiar are spiritual beings who, when they choose to interact with the physical world, take on physical forms. But those forms are, in a sense, dressed rather than essential. The true Maiar is the spirit, the will, the fundamental nature of the being. The physical form is a vehicle, adopted for the purpose of acting in the world. When a Maiar's physical form is destroyed, the spirit remains, though diminished and capable of eventually reforming another body. What Sauron did with the One Ring was to take a portion of his spirit, his will, his power, something genuinely and essentially him, and bind it into a physical object that was not a body, but a thing, a made thing, an artifact. This was not the same as taking a physical form, because a physical form can be dissolved and the spirit reforms. The ring was different. It was a receptacle into which something was poured that was not easily poured back. The ring and what it contained were bound together in a way that was qualitatively different from the spirit-body relationship. This is why the ring's destruction could destroy Sauron in a way that destroying his physical body could not. His physical body was like clothing. Lose it, and you were diminished and cold and vulnerable, but you could eventually get more. The ring was more like a vital organ. Lose it, and the loss was irreparable. You could survive for a time without it, diminished, struggling, but not indefinitely. The thing poured into the ring could not simply be reclaimed. Why did Sauron do this? Why accept this vulnerability? The answer is that the ring's power required this fundamental investment. You cannot dominate others at the level Sauron intended without putting something of yourself into the domination. The ring worked as a master key for all the other rings because Sauron's own will was the key. Without that personal, essential investment, it would have been just another powerful magical object. Impressive, but not the instrument of absolute dominion he needed. It was a calculated risk. He calculated that the ring would never be destroyed, that no one who found it would be able to bear giving it up, that if it were captured by an enemy, the temptation to use it rather than destroy it would always win. He based this calculation on his understanding of the world, which was deep and sophisticated, but had one systematic blind spot. It could not account for the genuinely selfless act, the act done not for power or even for survival, but purely out of love and the willing acceptance of loss. The mechanics of the ring's relationship to the other rings is also worth exploring more carefully, because it is more nuanced than simply the one controls the others. Each category of ring worked somewhat differently, and Sauron's dominion over their bearers operated through different mechanisms. For the 9 rings given to men, the mechanism was gradual possession. The rings conferred great power and long life, and these gifts were real at first, genuine enhancements of the bearer's natural abilities. A king who wore one of the 9 would truly be more perceptive, more persuasive, more difficult to harm. His realm would truly prosper, at least initially. The corruption was slow, like a tide coming in so gradually that you don't notice until the water is at your throat. Over centuries, the bearer's natural body was superseded by the ring's sustaining power. The natural life faded. What remained was sustained by Sauron's will, operating through the ring, and was therefore subject to that will in ways that became progressively more complete. For the 7 rings given to dwarves, the mechanism was different and partly failed. Dwarves were, as we touched on earlier, made by Aula and given independence by Eru Ilúvatar in an act of grace. Their nature was harder, more material, more deeply rooted in the physical world. They could not be made into wraiths in the same way that men could. Their substance resisted the kind of spiritual erosion that the rings visited upon mortal men. Instead, the rings worked primarily through amplifying their natural inclinations, the love of gold, the desire for greater and greater hoards, the expansive ambition of dwarven kings. This produced rich and powerful kingdoms, yes, but also dangerous obsessions, and in some cases the specific kind of hubris that led to disaster. Moria's delving too deep in pursuit of mithril, for instance, has often been linked to this amplification of dwarven acquisitiveness, though the connection is not made explicit in the texts. But crucially, the dwarves did not fall under Sauron's direct command through their rings. He could not simply will them to serve him. They were too independent, their will too strong in a specific, material, stubbornly resistant way. He found them, he said in anger and frustration, impossible to reduce to shadows. For the 3 elven rings, Narya, Nenya, Vilya, the situation was most complex and most interesting. These rings, as we noted, were made by Celebrimbor alone, without Sauron's direct hand, but they were made using techniques and knowledge that Sauron had taught, and the framework of rings as power vessels was itself his design, so they were not entirely free of his influence, even though he had not touched them. Their power was specifically preservative and healing. Nenya maintained the beauty and grace of Lothlorien, keeping it in a kind of timeless perfection. Vilya, the Ring of Air, enhanced Elrond's power of healing and foresight and wisdom, and maintained the sanctity of Rivendell. Narya, the Ring of Fire, kindled courage and hope in those around its bearer. These were not dominating powers, they were sustaining powers. They worked with the nature of things rather than against them. This is another reflection of the difference between the elvish approach to craft and Sauron's. The elves made things to preserve and enhance. Sauron made things to dominate and control. When the One Ring was destroyed and the 3 elven rings lost their power, the things they had sustained could not survive unchanged. Lothlorien would not remain as it had been. Rivendell would not maintain its grace. The specific quality of those places, that feeling of stepping outside of time, of being in a garden that the world had somehow agreed to leave alone, that was over. The Fourth Age would be their fourth age, not the continuation of the third. The elves who had maintained those places sailed west, taking with them the last of that particular light, and the places became simply beautiful in the ordinary way that beautiful places are beautiful, without the added depth of ancient elvish power behind them. This is something that is easy to overlook in the joy of Sauron's defeat. The victory was also a loss. The destruction of the ring that freed Middle-earth from the shadow also ended the age of elvish grace. The cost of Sauron's final defeat was the departure of the elves and the fading of everything their rings had maintained. It was the right price. It was worth it. But it was a price. Dear traveler, let your breathing slow a little more. The night is deep and steady around you, and we have more territory to cover still, more of this rich and remarkable history to move through together. Let us speak at some length about the Nazgul, because they are so central to Sauron's story and so deeply interesting as a study in what his method of domination actually produced. The 9 mortal men who received the 9 rings of power. Who were they? Tolkien gave us some details, but left much tantalizingly incomplete, which is itself a kind of wisdom. To name all 9 in full would somehow diminish them, reduce the nameless horror of their existence to a list. What we know is that they were great men in their day. Kings, sorcerers, warriors, lords of significant power and high ambition. They were not naive or easily deceived. They were precisely the kind of people who might look at a ring offered by a seemingly benevolent stranger and calculate the advantages correctly, up to a point. The chief of them, the Witch King of Angmar, was identified at some point during the Third Age as having been a great king in the ancient days. Some accounts suggest he might have been a king of Númenorian descent, which would explain both his power and his particular bitterness, the one who had most fully inhabited the proud Númenorian heritage before his corruption. He commanded the Nazgul in Sauron's name, directed their hunts and their armies, and carried a particular dread that even the other ringwraiths could not match. Then there was Khamûl, the Shadow of the East, the only Nazgul other than the Witch King who is named in the main texts. He was an Easterling king, one of those great men of the East who had accepted rings from Sauron and been drawn into his dominion. In the War of the Ring, it was Khamûl who led the search in the Shire and came closest to finding the ring-bearer before the crossing of the Brandywine, who sensed the ring's presence in the dark of the Shire lanes with a terrible acuity. The other 7 ring-wraiths are unnamed in most of the accessible lore, though Tolkien suggested in various notes that at least 2 more were Númenorian kings, and perhaps others were great lords from different peoples of men. The fact that they came from different cultures, different traditions, different corners of Middle-earth makes them collectively more representative. They are not a specific cultural failure, but a universal one, the human tendency to grasp at power and lose oneself in the grasping. What were the Nazgul actually like to be, if we can imaginatively access that? Their existence in the texts is defined by absence of comfort, of color, of the ordinary texture of living experience. They perceived the world primarily through the shadow realm, where the one ring burned with particular brightness, and where they could sense the presence of the living as a kind of warmth or vibration. The physical world, by contrast, was dim and insubstantial to them. They had passed so far into the wraith world that the ordinary things of life, sunshine, food, rest, the pleasures of any ordinary existence, were simply not available to them anymore. They could still feel something, but it was largely negative, cold and hunger of a particular metaphysical kind that could never be satisfied, and the overwhelming presence of the will that sustained them. Sauron's will, always a presence not of their choosing, but of their binding. To be a Nazgul was to be permanently, irrevocably not free, to have the sensation of will without its substance, to remember having been a person without being able to access what that meant anymore. And yet they were still effective, still formidable, still in certain ways brilliant. The Witch King in particular showing strategic and tactical intelligence of a high order. They were not zombies, they were not simply empty. They were prisoners, carrying the residue of their former greatness, while being forever unable to exercise it on their own behalf. This is Sauron's most complete demonstration of what his method of domination produces in practice. Not simple destruction. The Nazgul were not destroyed, not simple slavery. They still had something like individual will, something like personality. They were preserved in a state that was the perfection of Sauron's vision, entirely available to his purposes, entirely incapable of choosing otherwise, existing solely to serve. From his perspective, this was the ideal outcome. 9 of the greatest men who ever lived, perfectly preserved in terms of capability, permanently freed from the inconvenience of having their own agenda. From any other perspective, it was an almost unbearably terrible thing. Tolkien, who thought deeply about death and what follows it, had specific views about the condition of the Nazgul that are worth considering. The rings had stretched their natural lifespan beyond all proper bounds, and in doing so had denied them the natural end that Tolkien saw as a gift. The gift of men, as it was called, the ability to leave the circles of the world, to go beyond the walls of the world into something that even the Valar did not know. The elves were bound to the world, immortal, yes, but woven into it, unable to depart it as long as it lasted. Men were not bound in this way. Their death was not the end of their story, but a door. The Nazgul had been denied this door. Their lives had been extended past the point where the door was available to them, and then the door had been locked. They were neither alive nor dead, neither in the world nor beyond it. They were stuck in a way that was for Tolkien specifically theological in its horror, not merely suffering, but prevented from the resolution of suffering that natural death would have provided. When the One Ring was destroyed and the Nazgul were unmade, this was therefore not merely military defeat. It was, in Tolkien's framing, something closer to release. The terrible preservation was ended. Whatever came next for those 9 spirits, and Tolkien did not specify, probably because it was not his place to speculate on what lies beyond death, could not be worse than what they had been enduring. This is one of the quiet mercies threaded through the ending of the story, the liberation of the most imprisoned, most terrible, most pitiful of Sauron's instruments. Let us talk about the specific quality of Sauron's military strategy and how it evolved over the long ages, because this is a dimension of his character that is sometimes overlooked in favor of the more spiritual and philosophical aspects. In the First Age, as we have discussed, Sauron was primarily an administrator and a specialist in dark sorcery, the cultivation of werewolves, the running of Tolin Garhoth, the management of specific dark operations under Morgoth's overall direction. He was not primarily a battlefield commander in this period. His genius was more organizational and arcane than tactical. In the Second Age, after Morgoth's fall, Sauron was forced to develop as a more complete military strategist because he no longer had Morgoth's vast power to fall back on. His assault on Eregion was military in a conventional sense, armies sweeping across the land, but even here the preparation was primarily diplomatic and magical. The corruption of Celebrimbor, through the Anatar deception, the establishment of the ring network, the weakening of potential resistance before the open assault. When the elven smiths refused to be dominated, the military response was swift and overwhelming, but it was the last resort rather than the first. The campaign that preceded the War of the Last Alliance was also notable for its preparation. Sauron spent the years between his return to Mordor from Númenor and the Alliance's assault building his forces and his defenses to a formidable level. The siege of Barad-dûr, lasting 7 years, tells us something about how effectively he had fortified his position. He couldn't be swept away quickly, even by a combined army of elves and the best men in the world. By the Third Age, Sauron's strategic thinking had become extraordinarily sophisticated. The multi-front assault during the War of the Ring that we discussed earlier was brilliant in its conception. Simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, use of the Palantiri to corrupt potential allies and demoralize potential opponents. The Nazgûl deployed not merely as shock troops, but as weapons of psychological warfare that degraded the will of every army they moved through. The siege of Minas Tirith was not merely a military operation. It was a demonstration of irresistible power, designed to break the will of those watching as much as to break the walls of the city, and he maintained strategic flexibility. When the White Council drove him from Dol Guldur in 2941, he withdrew without a fight, not because he couldn't have resisted, but because the timing was wrong, and a fight then would have cost him resources he needed later. He was always thinking several moves ahead, always willing to yield a position in order to preserve the larger strategic picture. His one persistent strategic failure, the failure that ultimately undid everything, was his inability to model the behavior of beings motivated primarily by love and self-sacrifice. His strategic calculations were based on power. Who has it? Who wants it? Who would pay what price to get it or keep it? He could calculate perfectly well how a king or a wizard or even a great elf lord would respond to various pressures and temptations. He could not calculate how a hobbit would respond to the impossible weight of the ring on the slopes of Mount Doom, because hobbits didn't feature in his strategic worldview as meaningful agents. They were too small, their motivations were too domestic, their capacity for persistence in the face of apparent hopelessness was too alien to his own nature. It was, in strategic terms, a failure of imaginative empathy, the inability to model the behavior of beings whose fundamental motivations were unlike your own. And it is the same failure that underpins every great act of underestimation in history. The powerful dismissing the small, the certain dismissing the stubborn, the calculating dismissing the loving. Let us now speak of something we touched on but did not fully explore: the relationship between Sauron and language, and specifically the creation of the Black Speech. Sauron created the Black Speech as the official language of Mordor, intended to be the universal tongue of his dominion, the language that all his servants would be required to speak, replacing the diversity of Orcish tongues and the various languages of the men who served him with a single, controlled, deliberately constructed system of communication. This was extraordinarily characteristic of him. Even language was to be organized, unified, brought under control. The diversity of languages in Middle-earth, which Tolkien saw as something profoundly good and beautiful, a reflection of the diversity of peoples and their distinct ways of being in the world, was in Sauron's view merely inefficiency to be eliminated. The Black Speech was a hard, guttural language, angular and unlovely by design, stripped of the kinds of tonal beauty and associative complexity that Elvish languages had. This was not accidental. A language shapes the thoughts of those who speak it, and a language of domination was designed to shape minds toward domination, toward hierarchical thinking, toward the clear and brutal distinction between command and obedience, toward a conception of the world in which power was the only relevant variable. Gandalf pronounced the inscription on the ring in the Black Speech at the Council of Elrond, and the effect in the pleasant hall of Rivendell was immediate and disturbing. The fire darkened, the shadows deepened, those present felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The language itself carried something of Sauron's will, or at least an echo of it, the concentrated intention of a being who had put his power into words as much as into rings. Language, for Tolkien, was never merely instrumental, it was expressive of the nature of the speaker, and the Black Speech expressed Sauron perfectly. By contrast, the The Elvish languages, Quenya and Sindarin, were languages of a being utterly different in its approach to the world. They were beautiful, complex, associative, full of depth and layer and musical quality. They had evolved through contact between peoples, through the long history of Elvish experience of the world, through love of the things they described. You cannot say leaf in Quenya without also invoking, etymologically and associatively, the whole history of how elves thought about the relationship between growing things and the light that falls on them. This richness is the opposite of the black speech's reductive clarity. One language was made to control, the other emerged from love. That Tolkien, a professional philologist and linguist, placed such significance on language is not surprising. That he made Sauron a language creator as well as a ring forger is a particularly interesting choice. It says that Sauron's ambition was not merely physical or magical, but cultural in the deepest sense. He wanted to control not just what people did, but how they thought, what concepts they had available to them, what distinctions the structure of their language made possible or impossible. This is the ambition of the most thoroughgoing kind of domination. There is something else worth noting about the inscription on the ring and its function. The words that appear in the fire are not merely descriptive, they are performative in the linguistic sense. They don't just describe what the ring does, they enact it. The speaking or reading of them in the original black speech was itself an invocation of the ring's nature, a reminder to whoever encountered them of the terms of the dominion they were dealing with. It was a legal document and a declaration of war and a theological statement all in one, and it was written in the fire of the earth by the most skilled crafter of dark objects in the history of the world. Consider that for a moment, dear traveler. The ring's maker was so confident, so thorough, so absolutely committed to his design that he inscribed on the ring's surface the full statement of its purpose. He was not hiding what the ring was for, he was proclaiming it, because he was certain that proclamation could not undo the ring's power, that knowledge of what it was would not be sufficient protection against it. He was right about almost everyone. He was wrong about the two who ultimately mattered. Let us venture now into some of the more obscure but fascinating corners of Sauron's story in the later part of the Third Age, specifically the period between his departure from Dol Guldur and his revelation in Mordor, and what the White Council knew and suspected during this time. The White Council, Saruman, Gandalf, Radagast, Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, and others, was an informal body of the wise, created in response to the growing shadow that began to be felt in Middle-earth, roughly 1,000 years into the Third Age. Its purpose was to share knowledge and coordinate a response to whatever darkness was gathering. The fact that this council existed is itself testament to Sauron's influence. Even before he had revealed himself, even when he was the barely sensed presence in Greenwood South, he had already caused the wise to organize in a way they had not done before. Saruman was appointed head of the council partly because of his expertise in rings of power and in the specific technical knowledge that would be needed to understand and counter Sauron. He was the most studied of the Istari in these matters, having spent decades in careful research of the surviving records from the Second Age, the histories of the rings, the accounts of what had been done and how. If anyone could understand Sauron's methods technically, it was Saruman. But this was precisely the trap. Saruman understood Sauron's methods so thoroughly that he began to see their merit. His research was not pure scholarship. It was not merely the gathering of knowledge to counter the enemy. It was, gradually, the growth of admiration. He began to think like Sauron. He began to see the elegance of the ringcraft, the sophistication of the dominion through gift strategy, the beauty of the plan. And from admiring Sauron's methods to wanting to emulate them was a shorter step than Saruman ever admitted to himself. By the time of the White Council debates over the necromancer, Saruman's delay of action was not, as he publicly claimed, strategic caution. It was the action of someone who had a private interest in the search for the One Ring, who wanted time to find it himself before any confrontation might scatter it to new hiding places. He had concluded, and in this he was doing exactly what he would later criticize Gandalf for not doing, that possession of the ring was possible and desirable. He believed he was stronger than Sauron, or could become so with the ring's help. The irony is almost too perfect. The expert on rings of power, the one best equipped to understand the ring's nature and its dangers, was the one most thoroughly deceived by his own expertise into thinking he could handle it. Gandalf never fell into this trap, not because he lacked Saruman's intellectual capacity, but because he had a different fundamental orientation. Gandalf's deepest purpose was not to dominate, but to kindle, not to organize, but to inspire. He had no strategic ambition of his own. He was not waiting for an opportunity. He was simply doing the next thing that needed doing, meeting the next person who needed meeting, asking the next question that needed asking. And this absence of personal strategic ambition was precisely what made him resistant to the ring's appeal in the moment when Frodo offered it to him in the Shire. He knew, not theoretically, but in his bones, that he would start with good intentions and become something terrible, because his capacity for good could be bent by the ring into an equal capacity for domination. He was wise enough to fear his own gifts when the ring was the amplifier. This is perhaps the deepest wisdom in the whole story, and it is embodied in Gandalf's simple refusal. I do not refuse out of weakness. I refuse out of understanding. I know what I am, and I know what this would make of me. Let us also spend some time with a figure who is not often connected to Sauron in the most prominent discussions of the lore, but whose story is deeply intertwined with his, Tom Bombadil, because Tom Bombadil's presence in The Lord of the Rings has puzzled readers for decades, and some of the most interesting speculation about his nature concerns his relationship to Sauron and to the ring. Tom Bombadil, for those who know the story, is the seemingly ageless, cheerful, singing figure who lives in the old forest near the Shire, and who, in a very particular and remarkable way, is immune to the ring's influence. He can put it on without becoming invisible. He can hold it up and look through it and simply see Frodo, not vanish into the Wraith world. He seems unimpressed by it, and when Frodo puts it on in his presence, Bombadil can still see him. The ring's power of concealment simply does not function in his presence. What is Tom Bombadil? Tolkien said explicitly that he was deliberately mysterious, that he was an enigma, even within the world of the story. Various theories exist, that he is a Maiar who refused to take sides in the world's conflicts, that he is the oldest living being in Middle-earth, older even than the elves, that he represents the spirit of the natural world in some fundamental way, that he is Eru's expression of pure being, unconcerned with dominion or power because his relationship to existence is of a wholly different kind. Whatever his ultimate nature, his irrelevance to the ring is philosophically significant in the context of Sauron's story. The ring's power operates through desire, through the bearer's or the observer's ambition, through the wanting of things, through the craving for power, or for the ability to achieve good ends through domination. Tom Bombadil does not want these things. He is so thoroughly rooted in his own being, so completely content with what he is and where he is, that the ring's appeal finds no purchase in him whatsoever. The ring tries to tempt, and there is nothing to tempt. In a sense, Tom Bombadil is the answer to Sauron stated in the most fundamental terms possible. Sauron's power operates through desire, through making beings want what they don't have, through making the path to what they want run through him. Tom Bombadil desires nothing that he doesn't already have. His contentment is complete, and so Sauron has absolutely no leverage over him, no angle, no approach that would work. The ring, which is Sauron's will given physical form, simply has nothing to grip. This does not make Tom Bombadil a useful weapon against Sauron. The Council of Elrond considers and rejects the idea of giving him the ring, correctly concluding that he would simply lose it or forget about it, being careless of such things. He cannot be enlisted in the war because the war is not his concern. He is outside the dynamic of power and domination entirely, and therefore outside the solution to that dynamic as well as outside its threat. But he is a reminder that the dynamic is not universal, that there is a mode of being in which Sauron's particular form of evil is simply irrelevant, not defeated, not countered, but missed entirely, the way a net laid to catch fish in water doesn't catch birds in air. The free, contented, deeply rooted being is not threatened by the ring because it has no need that the ring might offer to supply. Let us now move into the period of the War of the Ring itself in more detail, paying particular attention to the ways in which Sauron's plan nearly succeeded and the specific vulnerabilities that were eventually found and exploited, because the story of how Sauron was defeated is ultimately a story about the intersection of strategy and accident, of planning and grace, of enormous power and its one insuperable weakness. Sauron's plan entering the War of the Ring was, as we have noted, a multi-front assault designed to overwhelm the defenses of the West simultaneously on multiple vectors. But beyond the obvious military dimensions of this plan, there were subtler components that are worth examining. First, there was the corruption of Saruman. This had been accomplished gradually, over centuries, through the Palantir of Orthanc, and it meant that when the war began in earnest, Sauron did not need to directly threaten Rohan from the west. Saruman would do it for him. Rohan, the great horse kingdom whose mounted warriors could have been a decisive factor in the defense of Gondor, would instead be distracted and eventually devastated by a conflict with Isengard. This was long-game thinking of the most impressive kind, a gambit planted centuries before it needed to be used, available and ready when the time came. Second, there was the use of Denethor. As we discussed, Sauron's manipulation of Denethor through the Anor Palantir was not about controlling him directly, but about shaping his interpretation of reality. A Denethor convinced of inevitable defeat was more useful to Sauron than a Denethor simply removed from power, because a defeated Denethor still commanded the defenses of Gondor, still brought his formidable intelligence to bear, but brought it to bear in service of a doom he believed was sealed. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. A commander who believes the battle is lost fights it differently, preserves resources differently, holds back forces that might have made the critical difference. Sauron was, in effect, using Denethor's own competence against him. Third, there was the timing of the assault. Sauron chose to strike before Aragorn could gather the full strength of the Dunedain and their allies, before the Rohirrim could fully mobilize, before the forces of the north could march south. The assault on Minas Tirith was timed to arrive before the siege could be prepared properly, before the beacons could bring their full effect. In fact, the lighting of the beacons was almost prevented by Denethor's despairing inaction. The campaign was a race against the mobilization of the West, and it very nearly won that race. What went wrong for Sauron, at the level of conventional strategy, was a sequence of events that none of his intelligence apparatus had accurately modeled. The Ents' destruction of Isengard neutralized Saruman not merely militarily but politically. It was not just that Saruman's armies were scattered, but that the information flowing to Sauron through Saruman was now unreliable, because Saruman had no further ability to act as an ally. The dead men of Dunharrow, the Oathbreakers of the White Mountains, those spirits bound by a broken vow from the time of the last alliance, were summoned by Aragorn and swept the Corsairs' fleet clean, freeing Gondorian forces to march from the south at a critical moment. And Éowyn and Merry's defeat of the Witch King at the critical moment outside the gates of Minas Tirith removed Sauron's most powerful immediate weapon at the moment when it should have been breaking the city. Each of these was, in different ways, something Sauron had not adequately modeled. The dead men, because their very existence as a useful force depended on Aragorn's willingness to invoke an authority he had not previously declared, and Sauron had not expected that declaration to come at this moment and in this way. Éowyn because she was a woman, and Merry because he was a hobbit, and the Witch King's prophesied vulnerability to no man had always, in Sauron's framework, been interpreted as irrelevant. No one who could challenge the Witch King would be excluded from the category man by the terms that mattered. But the prophecy did not care about Sauron's interpretive framework. The Ents because Sauron had, in some fundamental way, forgotten about them. In his plans and dispositions, the Ents simply did not appear as a significant variable. They were trees, or something like trees, ancient and slow, and they had not moved in living memory. And then they moved. This systematic underestimation of the old, the slow, the living things of the world that did not fit neatly into categories of power is deeply characteristic of Sauron's worldview. He was, in his way, a thoroughly modern thinker. He thought in terms of armies and resources and strategic assets and leverage. He did not think in terms of the things that persist beneath the surface of strategic reality. The ancient debts, the old songs, the slow-burning love that does not burn out even when everything else has, the natural world's own patient resistance to those who would dominate it. And this is why the war ended the way it did, not because the West was stronger. By any conventional measure, it wasn't. Not because Sauron made obvious tactical mistakes, he didn't, or at least not many, but because the world was deeper than his model of it, and it kept generating things his model had no place for. Dear listener, breathe slowly. The long story is moving toward its final settling. Let the weight of all these ages ease gently from your shoulders. Let us speak now of the aftermath of the War of the Ring in more depth, and specifically of what was rebuilt and what was not, and what the world looked like in the long shadow of Sauron's absence. Aragorn's reign as Elessar, the renewing king, was in many ways defined by the project of undoing what Sauron had done, not merely militarily, but culturally and ecologically. Mordor itself, under the direction of the new king, was carefully managed rather than simply abandoned. The enslaved peoples of Númenor, those who had been laboring in Sauron's fields, were freed and given the land as their own. This was a remarkable gesture in its practicality and its mercy. Rather than simply walking away from Sauron's most visible site of oppression, Aragorn turned it into a foundation for a new community, giving ownership to those who had been owned. The question of the Easterlings and the Haradrim was more complex. These were peoples who had, for generations, been part of Sauron's military machine, whose traditions and allegiances were deeply entangled with his dominion. They had not been defeated out of any personal malice. In many cases, they had been fighting for reasons that were comprehensible in their own cultural contexts. Aragorn's approach, as far as the texts describe it, was generally conciliatory, offering peace and terms rather than pursuit and punishment, trying to establish relationships of cooperation that might eventually replace the long histories of conflict. This was not naive. It was the recognition that Sauron's real legacy was not the physical destruction he had caused that could be rebuilt, but the web of animosities and fears and misunderstandings between peoples that his divide and dominate strategy had cultivated over centuries. To rebuild Middle-earth properly required healing those divisions, not simply winning the last battle. The forests were another dimension of the healing. The broad devastation of Sauron's industrial warfare, the clearing of forests for fuel, the poisoning of rivers and lands, the despoliation of natural beauty in the service of the war machine, this would take generations to recover. The Ents, who had played their decisive role at Isengard, returned to their wandering and their slow thinking, and slowly the living world began to recover. But slowly, very slowly, the passage of the elves was perhaps the most visible and most melancholy dimension of the post-war transformation. With the destruction of the One Ring, the power of the three elven rings faded, and with it the specific quality of the places they had maintained. Galadriel, who had held Nenya and maintained Lothlorien for nearly 2,000 years, sailed west from the Grey Havens with the other ring-bearers at the end of the Third Age, Gandalf and Frodo and Bilbo accompanying her. Elrond, keeper of Vilya, also sailed west, and Rivendell was left to become whatever it would become without the sustaining presence of the greatest of Middle-earth's healers. The half-elven Elrond had been a fixed point of wisdom and healing in Middle-earth for 3,000 years. His departure was not the departure of a historical figure, but of something closer to a natural feature, the permanent alteration of the landscape of wisdom in the world. Círdan remained for a time, continuing to manage the Grey Havens, continuing to receive those who wished to sail. He was the last of the great Eldar who had seen the trees, who remembered the light that had existed before the sun was made. His continued presence in the Fourth Age was a living link to the deepest past, a thread running unbroken from the earliest ages of the world to the new age of men. Let us speak a little of what happened to Mordor in the natural world after Sauron's fall. Tolkien suggests that the volcanic activity of Mount Doom, which had been sustained in part by Sauron's power and the ring's influence on the fires of the earth, changed after the ring's destruction. The mountain's great eruption vision at the moment of the ring's unmaking. That vast, final blast of fire and smoke that buried the armies of Mordor and swallowed the field of Gorgoroth in darkness was both a natural event and a metaphysical one, the physical world's response to the unmaking of the ring. In the years afterward, Mount Doom became less consistently active. The perpetual lurid red glow that had hung over Mordor for millennia began to fade. The ash-laden air slowly over generations began to clear. Whether Mordor could ever become genuinely habitable in the way that other regions of Middle-earth were, whether the shadow could fully lift from the soil and the stone, the lore does not fully resolve. But the implication is that it could, eventually, that nothing Sauron had done was so deep or so permanent that the natural world could not, over sufficient time, recover. This is consistent with Tolkien's view of evil as fundamentally parasitic. It can do tremendous damage, but it cannot permanently alter the fundamental nature of the world, because the world's fundamental nature is not evil's to alter. It can corrupt surfaces, but not change the deep grammar of what Arda is. Let me tell you about one more thread in Sauron's story that we have not fully traced: his relationship to the music of creation, to the Ainulindala, and what his fate means in the context of that primal history. In the beginning, Mairon sang. He added his voice to the great music of the Ainur, and his voice was part of the total vision from which the world was made. Everything that he was, everything that he would become, was somehow present in that first great act of creation, including, presumably, the capacity for corruption, the capacity for pride, the possibility of the road not taken. Tolkien believed in his deepest philosophical reflections on the matter that Eru Ilúvatar's providence was such that even the worst that Morgoth and Sauron did was, in the largest possible view, unable to escape the design. Not that Eru wanted the evil, not that the evil was good, but that the music had been constructed to encompass even its own dissonances, and that the world that actually came to be with all its suffering and shadow was somehow still the world that was meant to be, or more precisely, that whatever the world actually was, it was within Eru's capacity to bring good from. This is the most difficult, and in some ways the most beautiful aspect of Tolkien's mythology, and it's not one that resolves neatly into a simple statement. It doesn't mean that suffering was fine, or that Sauron was secretly doing good. It means that the world's story is longer than any age we have so far discussed, and that the final resolution of what the darkness was and what it cost and what came of it is not yet written, not in any text that we have access to. The last battle in Tolkien's eschatology is a future event at the end of time, when Morgoth, still imprisoned beyond the walls of the world, will break his bounds and return, and the world will be remade. In that second music, if we can call it that, everything that was lost will be recovered, and everything that was marred will be healed, and the full significance of all the choices made in the long history of the world will become, at last, clear. Tolkien was careful not to say too much about this. It was speculation or vision more than settled mythology. But the outline is there. The world's story is not finished, and the final word on even Sauron's long shadow has not been spoken. What does this mean for Sauron personally? It is, as Tolkien acknowledged, a mystery. The permanently fallen Ainur occupy a strange position in the eschatology, neither healed nor simply annihilated, existing in some diminished state beyond the circles of the world. Whether the remaking of the world involves them, whether the second music finds a place even for the most fallen voices, whether there is a resolution even to the discord, Tolkien did not say, and perhaps could not say, because that would be stepping beyond the proper bounds of a storyteller into territory that properly belongs to a much greater authority. But the possibility of it, the faint distant possibility that even Mairon's story has a resolution that is not simply, and then the darkness dwindled to nothing, seems to have mattered to Tolkien, not as sentimentality, not as softening the genuine horror of what Sauron did and was, but as a reflection of his belief that nothing that began in light simply ends in darkness without remainder, that the divine generosity that created Mairon the Admirable was not retroactively void, that the original gift of being and beauty and craft, however corrupted, however inverted, retained somewhere in its depths the memory of what it had been. This is not hope for Sauron in any comfortable sense. The choices made are made, and their consequences are real. The elves who died, the men who were bound, the free peoples of the world who suffered under the shadow. None of that is simply cancelled by theological optimism, but it is a refusal to say that the story is simply one of darkness winning and then being rolled back with no larger meaning. Tolkien's mythology insists on meaning even in the darkest places, especially in the darkest places. My dear traveler, you have come with me through such a long and winding night, through the first music and the years before years, through the making of the world and the earliest corruptions, through the first age's wars and the second age's deceptions and the third age's long shadow and its final lifting. You have heard the name in all its forms: Mairon, Gorthor, Anatar, the Necromancer, the Dark Lord, the Eye, Sauron the Abhorred, and watched the spirit it named change from something that shone to something that cast only shadow. You have heard about the ring, forged in fire and unmade in fire, that bright and terrible object that was at once a technical masterpiece and a portrait of its maker's deepest flaw: the inability to let go, the need to control, the choice of chains over the harder work of genuine relationship. You have heard about the people who stood against the shadow, the elves with their grace and their ancient knowledge, the men with their stubborn courage, the dwarves with their stone-hardened resistance, the hobbits with their cheerful ordinariness that turned out to be the most impenetrable armor of all, and the wizards, one of whom fell into the shadow and one of whom kept the faith in his wandering, eccentric fireworks and pipeweed way. You have heard about the places: the bright forge of Angband turned to dark purpose, the beautiful isle of Númenor swallowed by the sea, the ash wastelands of Mordor under the lurid glow of the mountain, the white towers of Minas Tirith holding their light against the dark, and the small green lanes of the Shire where the most important journey of the age began. And you have heard, underneath all of it, the quiet, persistent theme that runs through everything Tolkien wrote, that the great powers of the world are not, in the end, the determinative ones, that the small choices matter, that mercy extended to the seemingly irredeemable carries consequences beyond all calculation. That love, especially the most ordinary and domestic and unheroic kind of love, the kind that says I will carry you when you can't walk, the kind that says I won't give up on you even now, the kind that makes a hobbit in a dark garden think, I can see his star, and that's enough. That this love is the thing that the great designing intelligence of Sauron could never fully account for, because it operates by a logic that is simply outside his frame of reference. Sauron understood power, he understood craft, he understood desire and ambition and fear. He understood, in a cold and brilliant way, how beings with goals could be made to serve his purposes. But he did not understand, could not understand, the thing that is done for no purpose at all, except that it is the right and loving thing to do, the thing that is done not because it advances a plan, but because the person in front of you needs it done, and you love them. That was his blind spot. That was the crack in the wall. That was where the light got in. Take a slow, easy breath, dear listener. Let the images of this long story fade gently, like smoke from a fire that has burned down to coals. The wars are over. The ring is gone, the tower is fallen, the eye is dark, the ships are sailing west, and the grey sea takes them, and the gulls cry over the water. The Shire is green and quiet. Frodo is at peace, or will be, in the gentle gardens of the undying lands, where the light is different from any light in Middle-earth, and the weary are allowed to rest. And you, dear traveler, are in your warm bed, in your warm corner of the world, and the night is wrapped around you like a kindness, and there is nothing you need to do, or decide, or carry, or be right now. Nothing at all, just the slow sound of your own breathing, and the soft dark behind your eyes, and the last wisps of a very old story settling like snow in the quiet hours before before dawn. The story of Sauron is, in the end, a story about what we do with our gifts. Mairon was given extraordinary gifts: intelligence, precision, the love of order, the craft genius of a great smith's devoted student. He used them for a long time in service of something genuine and good, and then, step by step, choice by choice, he turned them toward domination, and the gifts became chains, and the craftsman became a tyrant, and the tyrant became a function, and the function was finally mercifully ended. But the story is also about the gifts that undid him, the smaller gifts, the gifts that look at first like nothing at all, the gift of stubbornness in a small person from a small place, the gift of loyalty that doesn't calculate whether loyalty is strategically wise, the gift of pity for a wretched creature in a dark cave. These gifts were not less real than his. They were simply pointed in a different direction, not toward control, but toward care, not toward possession, but toward protection, not toward the ring, but toward the friend. And in the end, those smaller gifts, working together in the dark of Mordor, did what all the armies of the West combined could not do. They reached the mountain, they let the ring fall, and the long shadow lifted. And so, dear traveler, as you rest now and let the long weight of this story settle into the deep quiet of your sleep, as your breathing slows and the images of ancient ages drift like clouds across the dark of your closed eyes, let this be the last thing you carry with you into the night, that the world is deeper than any shadow that falls across it, that the gifts of ordinary love are not smaller than the gifts of extraordinary power, and that even the longest darknesses end in morning. The mountains are still standing, the rivers are still running, the stars are out tonight, and they have been out for longer than any dark lord's memory, and they will be out long after every shadow has faded. Sleep now, dear traveler. The story is told, the fire is low, the night holds you gently. May the echoes of Sauron's long history, of Mairon's fall, and the world's patient endurance, and the small, stubborn love that outlasted all of it, guide you into the deepest and most peaceful of sleeps. May the stars of Vada be bright in your dreams. May the green of the Shire be with you in the morning. Good night, dear traveler. Good night, my weary listener. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and may your dreams be filled with nothing but peace and light, and the sound of water over smooth stone, and all the quiet, beautiful things that no darkness could ever, in the end, extinguish. Good night.